the response from the corrections officer. The doctor can demand that they be taken off. But in most cases, because you are an incarcerated person, it may not happen. In many cases, women have suffered as a result of it. And their children have been hurt and harmed as a result of this particular egregious condition of confinement. And so we need to understand that we are harming children and we're harming mothers, because trauma is trauma. And most women end up in prison because they've been traumatized. And we don't look at the trauma that women have experienced. And so when we think about this from this perspective, we know that we have to change this. That's my answer.
Thank you so much, Tina. And Pastor Glasgow, let me come to you. What is perhaps, your greatest victory in a policy change that was led by formerly incarcerated people, envisioned by formerly incarcerated people, strategized, fundraised for, and staffed by formerly incarcerated people?
I'm going to say is let my people vote. And getting the lawsuit won in Alabama where people can actually vote out of prison.
Say more about that, because I don't know that people understand that. How many states in the United States can people vote inside prisons?
Only 3 right now, which is Maine and Vermont. And there's only 7% and 9% black and brown folks in Maine and Vermont. We're actually the only and first one at this particular time that ever won a lawsuit where they could vote out of prison. Mississippi is one that we're working on now. Finna happen. Y'all come on now. Finna happen. And so we were able to go back into the draconian and white supremacy laws that exist in the 1901 Constitution of Alabama and get one of their catchphrases and clauses, and was able to win it in the federal lawsuit by the most ultra-conservative judge it was, to where if a person have a certain crime, they never should have lost their voting rights for 106 years. This was pioneered by a lot of us who were formerly incarcerated, a lot of training, a lot of up nights, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning with you. And so I just thank God for all of us being able to do it. Now we have a toolkit. And for those of you that don't know out here, Tasha and everybody here will be able to train you, teach you how to get people to vote out of your jails.
That's right.
Don't believe the hype. They can vote even though they're locked up in jail. And so I believe that's a secret voting block that's not on the vans or not on their voting list that we're able to change, especially the 2020 election.
It certainly made some changes in 2017. You want to say a little bit more about that?
Well, it made a great change in 2017. We were able to change a 25-year rule of the Republicans in the United States Senator office with Doug Jones against Roy Moore. I got targeted after that, and a lot of people got targeted after that, and a lot of people are still under target. And what I want to say to you is this: when you change the electoral power, there's only 2 kinds of power in existence. There's money power and people power. Guess what? We are the people.
Thank you for that. And, I don't know if it's still true, but it's certainly true in the first part of this millennium that had fully 30% of all black men were disenfranchised in the Deep South. Were that not the case, the Deep South would have been fully democratic since 1984. And so just to think about what that actually means and who's been elected, from Ronald Reagan, who dismantled the social safety net, to George Bush and everything that happened during that presidency, which we forget because of what's happening during this presidency. But Bruce, let me come to you and ask you, which piece of legislation you've worked on that was led by, envisioned by, and strategized by formerly incarcerated people that you're most proud of?
Well, I think the thing I'm most proud of is actually a precursor of our organization, Voters Organized to Educate, was the Angola Special Civics Project, which Norris was a founder of. And those guys, while locked up in Angola, created the first parole law for lifers in Louisiana, the 2045 law. If you had 20 years in, you were 45 years old, you'd be eligible for parole on a life sentence. So I think the very idea that they could muster the network and the power to push that through a legislature in the Deep South, That should blow people's minds for starters.
Yes.
And that was over 20 years ago. And then I want to say that one of the things I'm most proud of actually is building on the lineage of All of Us or None that coined the phrase ban the box. In San Francisco, someone can throw the year out for me if they want.
2006?
20 Yeah, and so Ban the Box has swept the nation since that time. And I learned Ban the Box from Dorsey and Linda and others. And then we passed Ban the Box in Rhode Island. We passed Ban the Box in Louisiana. I learned unshackling pregnant prisoners from Tina. We passed that in Rhode Island. The voting rights thing was entirely us. We took a multimodal strategy approach, movement-based lawyering. We filed a lawsuit. We had legislation and litigation. People across the state working their folks. It was an amazing victory that nobody thought was possible. People threw us to the curb. The non-unanimous jury issue was a ballot initiative where 64% of the Louisiana voters voted to end Jim Crow. Now, no one saw that coming. People thought it might have been 40%, maybe 50%, 64%. We won all but 3 parishes, right? And so, to me, it isn't just about whether you get the win. It's how you get the win. Who gets the win? What you can do with the win. What's the next challenge you're going to take on? And so I think it's really about getting wins that have mobilized people have been the greatest. But, you know, my one piece of legal literature is the racial history of felon disenfranchisement in Louisiana, and that was part of the way we took on the voting rights case and the legislation. And so I'm really proud of being part of that initial seed to grow the thing and grow the movement in a way. And I just want to shout out for a second. I'm having flashbacks as I was in a maximum security that was built in the 1800s and looks just like this. Wow. And the stone walls, the 5x8 cells where your cell looks just like these walls here. And I just want to shout out to all my people who are locked up right now who can't watch this. But hopefully they're going to hear about it and they're going to learn about it. And when they get out, they can be about it.
That's right.
Thank you for that, Bruce.
That's right.
And thank you, too, for including the Ban the Box legislation in this. I think it's critical to say that not only have you changed policy, there's also been a narrative shift.
That's right.
Right? So it's not as though necessarily Ban the Box ensured what we would have loved, which is like everybody having employment. But what it did do was for the first time put the question of the collateral consequences of being incarcerated on the table. And now you can't have a discussion about people being incarcerated without talking about the time after. And so I really appreciate that not only what you all have led has been a shift in law, but a shift in thinking. And Andrea, I'll turn to you on that question about what you are most proud of in terms of the work that you've done with women, both inside. You have melted those walls. Yeah. So both inside and outside of prison with women, and the legislation that you're particularly proud of.
Well, I think everything, every project, every campaign, everything that we do includes our sisters on the inside. And for the most part, that's who's driving the decisions we make around the work that we do. Dignity for incarcerated women was one of those things that Senator Booker, Senator Harris, Senator Warren all worked on. And it was a federal piece of legislation. And I want to point out what Bruce said. It's not the win you get, it's how you get the win. Because if you're not, the women, when you work on anything, any kind of campaign that is about the women inside, the brothers inside, they need to be leading that. That's not something that we do. We're the tools on the outside to carry their voices out.
Absolutely.
And so we are very proud that we worked on that on the federal level of going in back and forth, bringing out the voices and the information about the conditions of confinement of women in the federal system. And it was the ideas and the brilliance of the women inside who said, here's the laundry list of what we need and why we need it. You know, it's not just about having, feminine hygiene products. It's about empowering our people, breaking down those walls so that the men and women and the children who are in prisons in this country, that their voices are heard. The other thing that we're really, really happy about that also came when we were sitting in the prisons, separated from our children, we said we're going to find some way to have an opportunity in front of that judge. And I'm a former criminal defense attorney prior to my incarceration. I stood in front of plenty of judges trying to humanize men and women. But one of the things, particularly parents, we have to come up with some way. It's being worked on by the most directly affected women and girls in 11 states right now, passed in Massachusetts and Tennessee, which is the primary caretaker law. It's a gender-neutral law, but it says, damn it, if you are a parent, you actually matter, you have value. If you have children, your children matter, they have value, and we have to include something that doesn't cause too much disruption procedurally, that the courts can still work with, but that allow these parents to file a motion for the first time. There is a motion that was drafted in Massachusetts by Mallory, who's sitting in the back room right now, which actually speaks to the harm and the violence that prison really is in separating us from our children. And finally, I want to say, Pastor, we used to be 3 states. As you said, we're 2 now. We used to be the 3rd state. In 2000, they used the Constitution to take that right away. And our only black female senator at the time, Diane Wilkerson, said, we shall never, in this country, we should never use the Constitution to take rights away. And so we are actively engaged right now, boots on the ground in Massachusetts, ballot initiative to reinstate the right to vote of incarcerated people.
That's right. Let's do it. Let's do it. And we coming to help.
You know, let me pick up on what you were saying, Andrea, about humanizing people. And I almost hate that term, right? Like, why do we have to humanize human? You know what I mean? But we actually have to humanize people who are already humans. Can you just take, and thinking especially about many of the people who are listening to us who may not have your experience, your expertise, some of the real myths that exist about people who have been incarcerated. I mean, I remember, things that were said about me because I loved someone who was incarcerated. What kind of woman I must have been. They were said by guards when they were strip searching my husband and, hoping to get him riled up and do something that would get him put in the box. They were said to me by people who said they loved me. And that's my experience, with some remove. But I want to unpack some of those myths, because when we hear things like 1 in 4, 1 in 3, 1 in 2 black men, the other side of that is it's easy to say, well, black men are more criminal, right? So I want to just go behind some of those statistics and unpack for people how they think about folks who have been incarcerated and what they believe that they shouldn't believe because it's mythology. Andrea, would you start us off on that?
Sure. I think I'd like to just say this about that. We are experts of having that experience of living on a prison bunk. We have that expertise, and we need to share that expertise, both in storytelling, but also I want to say, and then I'll leave it up to the rest of the panel, I want to say to FIP, to my people, we are experts on what that is. But if we make the decision to come off and out of that story that we are an expert in and step into the policy-making space, I want you to make sure that you are educated. We cannot just say, just because we have had the opportunity or the experience of being on a prison bunk, that we know what we're talking about when we are doing things that are so dangerous to the forward movement of our movement to end incarceration, liberation of our people.
That's right.
And if you don't understand that, and Asha can give you a hell of a reading list, we have to do it, people. Otherwise, you're important and the story is important, but you have to understand the importance. You have to learn, read, educate yourself so that you're sure that you know whose water you're carrying.
Yes,
Let,
absolutely.
God, I'm-
let me just say for everybody watching, we've got 2 minutes. That was a masterful media literacy moment. So when you go, no matter who you're interviewing with and no matter what they ask you, you can certainly say, that's nice. Here's what I'm going to say. And so that is what Andrea just did. We have, it's all right. It's all right. We have 2 minutes. And so in that 2 minutes, I'm going to ask and see if you'll answer, what myths do people believe about people who have been incarcerated that you want to disrupt right here, right now, which doesn't undercut anything you said, which I also love, my love. Tina?
So the myth that I want to speak to is the one where women or mothers do not care about their children, or that because they use drugs, that drugs are more important. We have to look at all of the issues that bring a person to that. We have to look at trauma. We have to look at the harm that is done to them. Many women are involved in domestic violence, and Donna Hilton is here, and she's working on the DVJA implementation in New York. And I think that when we think about all the harms that have done to women and the harm that we do to each other, but looking at the way in which we are harmed, we are not without this moral construct. It isn't that we want to be drug addicts. It isn't that we want to commit crimes. It isn't that we do this without loving our children. In many instances, the things we do, we have to do because we need to survive. And so I think that when we think about the myths that usually are out there, we need to dispel them as formerly incarcerated women and make sure that folks understand exactly what we're up against.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for that. And Bruce, what myth would you want to dispel?
First, I want to say 100 to Andrea, and you get an A today.
Yes. Plus.
But one thing that I think we all kind of tangle with at times, I'm just going to dive in and say about this myth around the violent, nonviolent, and whatever.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
Now, I will speak up. Because just the other week, you know, I was talking, I was in this panel situation, and there was a judge who was talking about whether people were violent at the arrest and then nonviolent later, and she was kind of scorning the idea that someone could be nonviolent later when they were convicted of a nonviolent offense. And so I took the opportunity to say, I was violent once upon a time, one day. I was actually nonviolent when they arrested me a year later. And I was nonviolent a couple years later when I got sentenced. And I was nonviolent when I got paroled. I've been nonviolent as a father. I've been nonviolent as a person in the community. And I've been nonviolent ever since. Right? And so I'm not a violent person for life. I'm not a pit bull who bit that you have to continue to worry about whether I'm going to bite you again. I love pit bulls. Right? And sometimes maybe they have a reason for biting. Maybe they're under attack. Maybe you don't understand the pit bull. But you definitely don't understand me. And so people that judge me based on one action that happened in 1992 and forever after label me and all my brothers and sisters, we're of the super predator era, right? And since then, we've had Miller v. Alabama. Since then, we started to learn about things that any parent knew about child's mentalities not being fully developed until you're 25, you know? And since then, we've enshrined that in the law. Right? And so that's a good thing. We're moving towards this reality that we're humans that have human emotions, and we're all teenagers once. And for those of us who've been in foster care or homeless or challenged in all those types of ways, I'm just one of thousands and millions of people throughout the country who had challenges that you had to deal with on a daily basis. And realistically, something was probably going to go down at some point. And there was that one time that it went down. But I am not a violent person. And I want people to think about that when they start talking about violent, nonviolent, all that, because that is probably the number one myth that gets in the way of us trying to move towards the end of mass incarceration. We're not going to solve the problem by just having all the, quote, violent people locked up until they die.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that, Bruce. And Pastor Glasgow, I'm going to ask you to take us home. What myth would you dispel as we take our leave from the stage and invite our first candidate up?
So the myth that I would love to dispel is the myth that one size fits all. And the cookie cutter approach to us as being formerly incarcerated people, or currently incarcerated people. Because with us, there's no separation between the two. We're just out and they're just in. So the myth I want to take away is once a criminal, always a criminal. You know what's best for us. I would love for people to stop committing malpractice. Organizations and funders to stop setting up criteria for us to find that they set up without even talking to us. That's malpractice. So I would love to take away the myth of you trying to serve me, treat me, or clinicize me, or medicate me without even talking to me about my symptoms. Because that's malpractice. A doctor asks you when you go to his office, what's wrong? So he can make a proper diagnosis. I want to take away the myth of your malpractice and ask you to make a proper diagnosis of me and the rest of the formerly and currently incarcerated people and ask us our symptoms. Then make a diagnosis and let's me and you sit down to the table together so we could come up with our plan.
Absolutely.
Thank you for bringing us home with that. Join me in thanking this incredible panel, Andrea James, Tina Reynolds, Pastor Kenneth Glasgow, and Bruce Riley. Thank you so much. Thank you for setting this table so magnificently. How did that land for you? You feel like the table's been set? Feel like you're ready to have this conversation? So, the first candidate who we're going to be speaking with today is also the first person who agreed when we said, will you come and speak with people who have been system impacted? Will you come and speak with people who have been incarcerated? Will you come inside the site of a former prison and do that? We're going to hear in just a few moments from the junior senator from the state of California and the 2020 Democratic presidential candidate, Senator Kamala Harris, is with us today. She will be joined in conversation by Reverend Vivian Nixon, who has dedicated her life to ensuring that when women come home from prison, they have access to public higher education. And I'll say that has particular resonance with me. My parents were administrators at the City University of New York. I grew up in a family that believed in public higher education. And I knew when they started taking dollar for dollar in New York State, under a Democratic governor, the exact amount of money and putting it into the single largest prison expansion New York had ever known under Mario Cuomo, that there was a correlation between education and incarceration. They will be joined on stage by one of the most popular and brilliant Emmy Award-winning journalists in the field working today, Ari Melber of The Beat. And so we are very, very honored to bring them aboard and up on stage today. But as we do, I was thinking about everybody in California, talking to some friends of mine last night and unbelievably very early this morning. And as I think about the way that the wildfires and the smokes are disrupting people's lives, I also want to bring into the space all of the prisoners who are fighting. I want to remember the prisoners who lost their lives trying to save other people's lives. That's a myth I'd like to disrupt. But with that said, I'm going to make my way off of this stage and ask, please, Ari Melber and Reverend Vivian Nixon and Senator Kamala Harris to please join us on stage today. Or not, or I could keep talking to you and come back over here. There's always that surprise. Who knew? I'm trying to get a signal. Jimmy, who is working so diligently in the back, he's saying keep talking. They're walking up. Here we go. So A little awkward moment, but I don't care. This is the story of my life. It's the story if you've been system impacted, but we see them coming today, and so I'll try that again. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Ari Melber, Reverend Vivian Nixon, and Senator Kamala Harris.
Good day, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks for the warm welcome for Senator Harris and Vivian Nixon. I'm going to kick us off, and then Vivian's going to ask the first question, and we'll get right into it. Senator, thank you for being here.
It's great to be with you, with all these leaders. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
We've been following the same program that you've been watching backstage, and the theme that comes through, obviously, is mass incarceration has been a method where we have seen people disappeared, not only pulled out of their communities, but even after serving their time and doing their work, they return to the communities and are told they don't have a civic voice. They can't vote, as the Reverend was discussing. They can't participate. They are disappeared. And so I think it is obviously quite important that we're not only talking about that today and reflecting on that and learning from experts and the directly impacted, but clearly we're doing something about it, because this is now a discussion that will be led by people who are directly impacted. So that's the spirit. That's all I wanted to say to kick it off. I'm going to turn it over to Vivian to ask the first question.
Thank you, Ari.
Okay, we've got a microphone on the chair, too.
Oh, I must have missed it. I didn't see it. Thank you. Thank you, Ari. And thank you, Senator Kamala Harris, for joining us, and to every single person in the audience for taking time out of your schedules to be here. It's a small and tight but extremely powerful room. I can look out and see the work that all of you have done to get us to where we are today, so thank you. Senator Harris, today's town hall is the first time a conversation between presidential candidates and impacted people on criminal justice reform has taken place during this election season. You were the first candidate to commit to coming to our town hall today.
That's right.
Why are you here today, and why have you chosen to prioritize this in your campaign to be the next president of the United States?
Thank you, Reverend. One, it is about my life's work, and it is also about what I know that if we are going to be a nation that redemption, an age-old concept, right? In the Christian faith, but in many religions, which says because it knows everyone will make a mistake. For some, that will rise to the level of being a crime. But is it not the sign of a civil society that you allow people their way to earn their way back and give them the support? So yes, there will be accountability, but there also must be a path. And I have visited many prisons. I know what has been going on in the system, which is why way back when I made a very conscious decision to become a prosecutor, knowing how broken and how unjust the criminal justice system of America can be. And so when I was in a position where I didn't have to ask anybody permission, when I was the elected DA of San Francisco, I created one of the first in the nation reentry initiatives, focused on what we must do, understanding that we have to allow people a way to come back to the community and give a path that includes focusing on education, focusing on job skills development, focusing on housing, focusing on the fact that so many are parents who have a natural desire to parent their children, even if not the resources or the skills. And so knowing that you were hosting this forum, I am now running for president, I just wanted to come and be a part of this conversation and lend whatever I could to this important gathering of leaders. So thank you.
Thank you. So just to follow up on that a little bit, I'm going to read you a quote that you may recognize.
Okay.
America has a deep and dark history of people using the power of the prosecutor as an instrument of injustice. I know this history well, of innocent men framed, of charges brought against people without sufficient evidence, of prosecutors hiding information that would exonerate defendants, of the disproportionate application of the law. Do you recognize that quote?
Yes, I do.
This is from your recent memoir.
Yes, those are my words.
And I want you to reflect kind of on the theme of redemption that you just brought up.
Yeah.
And the fact that there are progressives who are looking at some of your prosecutorial record and identifying moments that didn't seem so progressive to them. And wondering, how do you reconcile that with the decisions you have to make as a prosecutor?
Yeah.
And what has changed since that time? What have you learned through the process of having to make hard decisions that didn't please everybody?
Well, there's so much, thankfully, that has changed since that time. Remember, when I decided to become a prosecutor, because frankly, one should know themselves. I knew I wasn't so good asking permission. And I knew I wanted to be in a role where I could implement change in the criminal justice system. And so I decided to, go up the rough side of the mountain and go inside, where I could make decisions. And so when I made a decision to create Back on Track, it was one of the first in the nation. And as you know, folks, when I was elected to DA back in 2003, which are the dark ages compared to where we are now in terms of what the country understands we need by way of reform. And so when I created that initiative, people would say to me, why are you giving them jobs? Other people who have not committed any offense need jobs. People would say to me, you're supposed to be a prosecutor, which means you're supposed to be locking people up, not letting them out. And so, but it took a force of will, and I took some hard knocks for it, to say, no, we need to do better. And because I literally pulled out a yellow pad and wrote down and created the program. I said, I know, for example, 18 through 24-year-olds, so many have now been felons for life and branded felons for life because they took a path that appeared to them to be their only path of economic opportunity, which was to sell drugs. And now they are felons for life. I looked at the fact that there were so many who were being arrested. And I said, I'm going to create a program around that population, knowing that 18 through 24, if they were in another circumstance, such as in college, Ari, they'd be called college kids. But when they're in the system and you turn 18, you're considered an adult, period. Even though we know when they're 18 through 24 in college, what do? We put them in dormitories with a resident assistant because we know, and sometimes a curfew, because we know they may not make good decisions sometimes. But for that same population when they're on the street, their entire life can be faced with the burdens of lengthy incarceration, of being prohibited from voting, from being banned from having access to federal resources, including everything from student loans to SNAP to getting able to get a job or qualify for the certificate that is necessary to take on the job that will allow you dignity and a way to support your family. So I created this program, and it included bringing in folks like the building trades, right? The ones who have the apprenticeships, the carpenters were amazing. It included bringing in lawyers to teach these young people, men and women, their rights around. I used to teach street law, so we were teaching them about landlord-tenant and laws like that, so they would have the power that they needed. And we ended up reducing their recidivism by such huge proportions that it became a national model. The Holder Department of Justice designated my program as a model of innovation for law enforcement in the United States. And I knew this work was possible. I knew the work was possible that we did later when I became Attorney General. I wanted to take it statewide. So in the California Department of Justice, which I ran, which is the second largest Department of Justice in the United States, we started a recidivism reduction and reentry division of the State Department of Justice, creating incentives for counties around a state of 40 million people to do exactly what we knew could be done to help re-enter folks. And we also created, because again, I didn't have to ask anybody permission. I was running the agency. So we also created a data collection system. Tell me about deaths in custody. Tell me how many deaths in custody, where. Answer the questions of how those deaths in custody are occurring. because otherwise the families often can't get answers, but the system is not holding itself accountable.
So, Senator, I want to jump in only because, and I'll do it to everyone, I want to get audience questions. So I have one follow-up to Vivian's, and then we're going to go to an audience question.
Yes.
The follow-up is, when you talk about this record,
Yeah.
part of your argument has been what you were just saying, which is you were doing a lot of things that were for reform.
Yeah.
And you've also talked about changing some positions. For example, you've publicly said you back now independent probes when there's police-involved shootings.
Yeah, we can talk about
and there
that.
was a
Let's talk
shift
about
on that. I wonder if, given where we are and the audience we have here, has there been a time where you have seen something that came out of your office, in the prosecutorial's office or the AG, and you look back on it and you say, we went too far, or you've said to any impacted family, that sentence was too long.
Yeah.
Is there a place to say not only everything we did for the right reason at the time, but looking at it now, we went too far? Is that part of your view?
Absolutely. That's why I have been pushing for years for what we need in terms of sentencing reform. You will see from my criminal justice policy when I become president, it includes also doing what we need to do to give federal resources to local counties to process expungements, because there's a real backlog where they occur. It's about taking clemency reviews out of the Department of Justice, because that's the very place where the sentences occurred, and so that there will be an independent analysis of it. It is about legalizing marijuana. It is about taking the profit out of prisons. And so on day one, I will shut down federal funding of for-profit prisons. But here's the other thing, Ari, that I do want to say on this subject. I am the only person on that debate stage who has dedicated their life to reforming this criminal justice system. I've been working on that since the early 2000s. There are a lot of people who have language now about it, but I would ask you to challenge them, ask them, what have they actually done to reform the criminal justice system? And then I will have more of a conversation with you about my record.
So the senator has questions for me, too. We wanted to get that answer, and I want to turn, as promised, to Ivelisse Galestra.
Hi everybody.
Done.
First of all, this is great to be here with great minds, survivors. Okay. So my name is Ivelisse Galestra, and I am the community organizer for College and Community Fellowship.
Right.
My question is to you, Senator Harris. Last year, Congress passed the largest criminal justice reform measure in recent history, the First Step Act, which is problematic in itself. You supported the bill, but called it a compromise of a compromise. Yeah. And many criticisms of the legislation and other reform efforts stem from the focus point that it basically geared towards nonviolent and low-level transgressions. Mm-hmm. So if any real progress is to be made to end this narrative, where do we leave serious or even violent transgressions, right?
Yeah.
So my question is, what is your vision of how we can shift this dominant narrative and social construct and analyze the root of violence in the United States of America and really,
that's right,
really include people with violent transgressions as me, a Latina with a violent transgression in the conversations,
that's right,
and in the criminal legal efforts
that's right,
that we are discussing now.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you're right. You're right. I was very critical of the First Step Act, and I actually was unwilling for quite some time to sign on to it. We were able to negotiate as a result of that some improvements, but it's a fine first step. But we need that's like saying you just took a first step, but you need to learn how to walk. We actually need like the plan for step 10. And so it relates to a number of things. It's about what we need to do around so-called serious and violent offenses and what we do around reduction, for example, of sentencing. So you'll see in my plan of action when I become president, includes re-examining sentences that are 20 years long or longer and re-evaluating them to determine if there should be a release or a shortening of that sentence. Because I am all too well aware of the fact that you can talk about reform of the system starting today and moving forward, but there are still hundreds and thousands of people who have been incarcerated and are currently incarcerated under the former system, and so we need retroactive application, which the First Step Act did not do adequately. Right. Let's talk about incarcerated women. So during my career, a large part of my career as a prosecutor was focused on crimes against girls, children, and women. I specialized for a long time in child sexual assault cases. I specialized for a long time in rape cases, human trafficking cases. And I am very aware that up to probably more like 90% of the women who are incarcerated have in their lifetime been abused on one level or another. I am all too aware that the women who are incarcerated, that the incarceration of women in America has increased 8-fold since 1980. I am all too well aware that we have a system of incarceration in this country. You know, we talk about child separation policies, of which I'm fighting against as it relates to our immigrant brothers and sisters. America's criminal justice system has child separation policies. Let's talk truth. Let's talk truth. And this relates to both men and women. Because here's the other thing I know. Young men, older men, they want to father their children. They may not be paid child support, but they love their children and want to be engaged with their children. And as it relates specifically to women, we place them often hundreds of miles away from their children. As a population of incarcerated women are sentenced to shorter periods of time, which means they're coming out. They want to and need to bond with their children while they're in. And we're charging inmates, regardless of gender, at least $1 a minute to have a phone conversation with their families. Charging people up to $22 for a bar of soap when they're incarcerated. And no plans for recognizing that, okay, this person may have offended on one way or another, but they are still a parent. And there is still a family. And so I look at the incarcerated women population about all of the collateral consequences of incarcerating women. So you will see in my plan of action, there is heavy emphasis on decarceration of women. Also what we need to do to allow for overnight visits with their children, and also doing an assessment and requiring reporting about how far in miles and distance we place women from their children, and from men, the same point. Because these are all issues that we are not discussing that are very real. When we talk about reentry, we have to look at the effect on the children of incarcerated parents and understand all that we are doing to create trauma for those children because of the incarceration of their parents, and how we need to address that to avoid that trauma. Not to mention the fact that one of America's biggest public policy failures has been mental health. And so what has ended up happening is we're using jails and prisons as the antidote for the failure to address mental health in America.
Well, that being said, and relating it back to the First Step Act.
Yes.
Which relies heavily on risk assessment tools.
Yeah.
That are biased.
They're awful.
And so if you are going to be evaluated by a biased tool, and you have a history of mental illness, or if you happen to be incarcerated at an early age for your first time, all of that counts against you.
That's right.
As it pertains to getting access to the programs that make you eligible for early release.
That's right.
That is disparately going to impact poor people and people of color and people who have mental health problems. How would you change that element of First Step?
Right.
And also, how would you change the influx of money that is going to come from the federal government to private industries to make electronic monitoring the next wave of incarceration?
Yeah, no, you're right. And so let me just say that back to the earlier question, that was one of the reasons that I opposed the First Step Act, because they had the risk assessment being created by the Attorney General, who at the time was Jeff Sessions. You hear me? So we got it shifted so that it would be with consultation of the experts before any risk assessment system would actually be approved. We've got to take money out of the criminal justice system and profit. So I mentioned earlier what it is around what we need to do and can do and will do around shutting down the for-profit prisons. But there are whole industries that are associated with the incarceration people, including those monitoring, the electronic monitoring, where the business model is still to shackle somebody and make money from it. Let's talk about the video conferencing system in prisons. Extremely expensive. People are profiting off of the desire a human being has to stay in touch with their family. The telephone system, the commissary. People are supposed to be allowed at least 1 bar of soap a month. They're paying $22. There have been studies that have done for a bar of soap. So there has to be, and this is part of what my intention is in terms of what action we're going to take, is to do a whole, basically, audit of America's federal prison system to figure out who is making the money, who is charging what, where that money is going, and to whom. Because be clear about it to the point, Reverend. There are a lot of people making money off of this prison system and the system of incarceration. So when we talk about the pulls and the pushes in the system, part of it is profit, people making money.
I want to go out to another audience question and pick up on something that's obviously been in the national conversation a lot when you think about the tensions around the president and whether, as we sit in a former penitentiary, whether he is in fact often acting in lawless ways without accountability. We talk a lot about checks and balances in America, and yet there are so few actual checks on the treatment of individuals once they're incarcerated. But if America is going to have checks and balances, then that has to be provided for. And I think that's part of the thrust of the next question. I want to turn to Dennis Gaddy. Dennis, thank you for your question. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you, Senator Harris, for being here for this historic event. Dennis Gaddy is my name. I bring you greetings from the state of North Carolina, where we're part of the Voters Organized to Educate Family, as well as the North Carolina Second Chance Alliance. And a big shout out to the group that I lead, Community Success Initiatives, who's having a watch party in Raleigh today.
Oh, wonderful.
Right. I cut my teeth 15 years ago trying to be a part of this work about reentry, and I followed you. I watched you as being part of that time when there wasn't even a word called reentry back in those days. And I was able to learn from you and Jeremy Travis and John Jay and those kinds of folks. So the question I have for you today is this. In prisons across the country, people who are incarcerated are living in inhumane, abusive, and unsafe conditions. There's currently a law on the books called the Prison Litigation Reform Act, or PLRA, which severely cripples the ability of incarcerated people to challenge the conditions of confinement. Elected leaders should not have to be sued to change these conditions. If elected president, you're going to be in charge of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which is one of the largest prison systems in the country. What policies will you put in place to make sure that conditions of confinement are humane and rehabilitative? And do you support repealing the PLRA?
Yes to the last part, if it in any way prevents people from suing or having their day in court and having their moment of justice. But as I said earlier, one of the first steps that's now been, one of the first points of action that I will take is an audit. We need to conduct an audit across the board to make transparent and clear what too many people who have been incarcerated and their families know too well. And that's part of what I did in California when I was running the Department of Justice there, is to make public all this stuff that had been held secret. And then so the activists and the leaders from the outside would have to scrape and scratch to get the data out, to get the facts out. So one, do that to make it transparent, but also to take the profit system out of the prison system. And then also things like what I've been doing even in the Senate around, for example, conditions for incarcerated women, where we still have in states a practice and policies where women can even be shackled during childbirth, right? So these are the kinds of things that we have to do. But we need to take action right away. Legislation is fine. I'm all for it. But this is part of one of the reasons I'm running for president is to reform America's criminal justice system. It is, to your point, part of my life's work. And I know what we can do to actually do better. And look, nobody can question when I say that we need to reform the system. I have safety and everybody's safety in mind. I know that we will have healthier and therefore safer communities when we reform the criminal justice system of America. Because let's be clear about this. Part of what I think the problem on public policy with criminal justice, part of the problem has been that people think the goal is safe communities. So if you think the goal is safe communities, then you immediately go to systems of incarceration, systems of law enforcement. Instead of understanding the goal should be healthy communities, because healthy communities are safe communities. And healthy communities are achieved by putting resources into mental health, into affordable housing, into job training, into public education, into family support systems. That's how you create healthy communities, which will always be safe communities.
I'm just jumping in because we have 4 minutes. As you
Yes.
know, you have a very busy schedule.
Yes.
I know Vivian wanted to touch on education.
Yes, let's do that.
Yeah, let me touch on one more thing about the conditions. Will you work to ban solitary confinement?
Oh, it's already in my plan.
Okay, good.
I'm banning solitary. No, it's there. I will not just work. I will ban solitary confinement of both adults and juveniles.
Thank you.
It is inhumane.
It is.
And unnecessary. Yes.
Thank you. I've spent the better part of all of the 20 years I've been out of prison to empower women with criminal justice histories to earn college degrees. Our goal in my organization is to support these women so that they can thrive, so their families can thrive, and so their communities can thrive. This system is woefully inadequate in preparing incarcerated individuals to reenter society in any meaningful way other than subsistence living.
Yeah.
You did excellent work in California in making sure that higher education was available
Yeah.
in every prison. What other things will you do as president to ensure that people can get above that razor wire ceiling
Yeah.
that most of our reentry efforts limit them to?
Yeah, and there's a lot to be done, but I will also connect it with what we need to do immediately when folks are released, because we've got to not only ban the box, we've got to end the federal bans on federal support going to folks for everything from SNAP to college loans and student loans to housing. All of these bans make the education we can offer meaningless if when people come out they don't have access to the resources that help everybody else actually go on to those paths for employment and higher education. So within the incarcerated population, it's not only the work that I've done in the past, as you said, around education and the partnership that needs to go into that, but also it truly, I cannot underemphasize enough the need for real resources going into mental health and treatment. I look at issues like childhood trauma. The number of children that we have growing up with trauma, because let's be clear, poverty is trauma-inducing. Being exposed to violence is trauma-inducing. And when we don't have those interventions, they normally lead to what we end up seeing in the incarcerated population, and we have not ever had any real intervention. And so if we're going to help people get on their feet when they get out, that has to be a big part of it. In addition, it has to be about getting people on the pathway towards the jobs that need to be filled. And so that means having education that is about getting that certificate and not just wood shop. I'm so sick of these programs that I'm just sick of it, honestly. I'm sorry. But, I mean, literally, if you go, it's about the quality. It's not just saying there's going to be training, because we all know that training that usually happens in jails and prisons is nothing compared to the jobs that need to be filled and that pay enough for people to have a quality of life. Like literally, Ari, wood shop is being taught, where people are using the saw to make a key. I mean like a big key, a decorative wooden key. That ain't getting nobody a job. And right, we know what I'm talking about. So it has to be about meaning. And then again, that's about doing an assessment of what is actually happening in terms of the quality of the training, not just training, check the box, but the quality of the training.
And I'm told that we're a minute out, and so I want to end with we've talked so much policy, which I think is a testament to the seriousness and the expertise in this room. All of you, Vivian, and of course we're dealing with an expert. I want to end on people, not policy.
Okay.
You're here talking to people. I'm just going to be direct. I'm a reporter, so I just say what I think is true. You're talking to people who, as we discussed, have been told through the rules and through the treatment, oftentimes their voice doesn't matter. And even after they pay their debt to society, their voice doesn't matter, or they don't get a voice anymore. And on the panel before you came out here, of course, on issues, people were speaking about the different state levels to reform that. I think in closing, with whatever else you want to say in closing, because we want to give you a final thought, could you tell us in the world, because the world's watching, obviously, beyond this room, why was it important to you to come have dialogue with people who have served time, with family members who've been through this? Why is it important that these voices are part of how we pick the next president?
Well, these are the leaders. This is a room of leaders who understand what is actually happening in the system, and who know that if we're going to be true to our values, and if we want healthy communities, if we want to be true to the values of redemption, we have to agree that the incarceration system of America is one of the greatest failures of public policy in our country. It is truly. The emphasis has been on punishment. The emphasis has been on pushing people out instead of allowing people a way back in. And it has not been thoughtful. It has been punitive. It has been a result of wars that have been waged on Americans. Like, be clear about that too. So much of what has led to America's mass incarceration has been based on domestic wars. The war on drugs, that was a war on our own people. That's how that actually played out. And so these are prisons that are like federal detention centers, like as though these are people who are threatening our nation's security. I mean, if you want to talk about a threat to nation's security, talk about Donald Trump. I know. And so, if you want to talk about lawlessness, so anyway, the bottom line is this: we need to reform this system. I wanted to be here to be able to listen, to be able to share my piece of this process that has been a process of people shedding a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to try and have America understand that it is a broken, failed system and must be reformed. And I'm honored to be among the leaders who are here, and I thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Senator.
Join me in thanking Senator Harris. We will be back with more. Senator, thank you. Vivian, thank you.
All of you, please join me in giving a rousing thank you to Reverend Vivian Nixon, Senator Kamala Harris, and the always incomparable Ari Melber. Thank you so much. For our friends in the press, let me note that if you can hold for 2 minutes, the senator has generously agreed to make her time available, but please hold for 2 minutes to members of the press. Everybody else, we now are going to go to a 10-minute break. Let me encourage you, if you do not have to leave the space, don't leave the space. But it's a hard 10 minutes because we are live. With that said, what is it? When do we need to be back by? Is it 2:45? 2:45. You have until 2:45. Thank you.
My name is Ayanna Thomas Bazil, and I was sentenced to 36 months in a federal prison, and my charges were bank fraud and conspiracy to commit money laundering. My husband did some illegal business, and I took some of the money out of his account and put a check into my own personal account. And I didn't actually commit the crime, but because I knew that the funds weren't legal and I profited from it, I also got charged with my husband. I think if I was Madoff's wife, I would have went to Connecticut and bought a house and sat my behind down and had a little bit of money in my account, been able to work or do what I had to do if I was Madoff's wife. But I didn't come as Madoff's wife. I came as Raymond's wife, so it was different. My son was 12 and my daughter was probably 6. One morning they left for school, they came back and we were gone. My husband went in a year before me. We had got the same 36-month sentence. The first day is the worst day. You remember your first day and your last day. But the first day is the worst day. You get put into this dormitory for newbies with these bunch of women that you don't know. A few of the women interested in experience because they come in and they're like soccer moms detoxing off of their OxyContins and they're throwing up and they're dry heaving and you're seeing them using the bathroom on themselves, they're throwing up on themselves. I'm looking over like, is this really real? Most of the women there were there for money and drugs and crimes committed with their boyfriends and husbands, but from all walks of life, white, black, Asian, everyone. The women are bonded usually by culture. Most of the Hispanic women are together, the Caucasian woman, and there's the black woman. I kind of was like all over because I didn't really fit because my dynamic was that I was from Brooklyn, but I was a suburban mom. My best friend was a Caucasian girl. She had the husband, she was here, her kids were gone, my kids were gone. We had to go through the crime when you got report cards, when you got pictures, when you had visits. You have to have someone with you that helps support you through that because when you have a visit, you can't even get up the next day because it takes everything from you, like everything when your children are leaving you. We told my daughter that I was in the military. We said Dad went to the military and Mom is gonna have to go too. Because if I send her a picture, I was in my little green military suit. And when she saw me, I was in the green suit. There was one visit. She's like, well, I don't want to leave. And I was like, well, Auntie Sarah has to take you back home. And, you know, you're giving this whole story about why you have to go back. And she's like, Ma, I just want to stay here with you. I can, like, get McDonald's and we could just come back. Because she wanted McDonald's. And she's like, we could just come back and have McDonald's together. And I think, and that was the only time I think that I cried. My son cried. It was, like, awful. It was like you ripping her from me because she just didn't want to go. You kind of feel like a failure, and now you're failing again. And it was rough. But we have our own place, and we have stability, and we stay where we are, and we're happy where we are. I did it.
I did 21 years for a crime that I committed at 17 years old in which no one was physically hurt, harmed, or injured. And I was a first-time felony offender. And I've gained so much knowledge, I've gained so much, experience, and I've accepted responsibility for what I did wrong. Well, what other reason is there to keep me in prison?
When Dante Mitchell was 17 years old, he was sentenced as an adult to 35 to 70 years in prison. His sentence is comparable to that of a murderer, even though no one was injured in his crime. Black youth are 9 times more likely to be sentenced as adults than white youth. Dante has now spent more than half of his life in prison, and he's not eligible for parole for 6 more years.
When the judge told me 30 years, I kind of like been in denial a long time.
Dante, who grew up in Albany, New York, describes his childhood as traumatic. He witnessed abuse, his father wasn't around, and his mother was addicted to drugs.
It was very, very hard for Dante, but he was a good kid. He would man up, he would feed his sisters, he would clean the house, He just did a lot more than a young child should have to do.
At 11 years old, Dante was removed from his mother's home. For the next 5 years, he lived in various foster care homes before aging out of the system at 16. He ended up at a temporary shelter for homeless youth called Equinox.
Equinox was in Albany, New York. It was just, the staff, they were pretty cool. They were, very responsive to the needs of the children there. I just never had that, having that level of adult support and caring.
There was something kind of striking about Dante, and that was how quick-witted he was, how intelligent he was. I mean, it was just obvious the first time he opened his mouth and talked about himself was that this is a very, very bright young man.
Dante bonded with the staff at Equinox and even flourished during his time there. He got his GED and started working part-time. But after 60 days, he had to move out due to state law. Dante moved in with an aunt and says it was there that his step-cousin introduced him to the idea of breaking the law.
I was always the one that wanted to work. I wanted to go to school. I wanted to do these things, so I wasn't really exposed to that. But when I did become exposed to it, it was just like, all right, let's try it, and it just kind of snowballed from there.
First, Dante and his cousin tried a few robberies. Then Dante held up a McDonald's where he had previously worked.
I went in there with 2 guns, a mask on, fired 1 shot over the sign, told everybody, what did I say? I can't remember exactly what I told everybody. I think I said freeze, don't move, whatever, some kid stuff. Told 1 girl, put the money in the bag. I took the manager in the back, had him open up the safe and put the money in the bag. Then I said, everybody go in the freezer and put a lock on it. I knew they can get out because they have it's a safety, because people might get locked in freezers, so they had a safety. But that was to slow them down, and I left. I don't know what I was thinking. I couldn't have been thinking anything. Just being a kid, thinking, that's my cousin, you're into it, why not? Not really looking at the long-term consequences for that type of life. It was just boneheaded.
Despite being 17 and a first-time felony offender, Dante was charged as an adult and received the maximum sentence of 35 to 70 years, which was reduced to 25 to 50 due to state sentencing laws.
Nobody was hurt. Nobody was injured. Nobody was killed. Nobody was beaten. Nobody was stabbed. And here's a young man who may spend 50 years in prison.
All of this happened at a time when rising crimes among teens triggered a public fear of juvenile criminals.
They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel.
Thousands of juveniles across the country, mostly young men of color, were sentenced to life without parole or given the death penalty. The amount of prisoners under 18 years old in adult prisons doubled and reached a peak of 5,400 on a single day in 1997.
We take people who do violent things because something violent has been done to them or they've lived in some place where violence is part of life, and we put them in a place to modify that behavior that runs on violence. You can't survive unless you know deeply the power of violence.
Sentenced the day before his 18th birthday, Dante entered the maximum security prison, Great Meadow Correctional Facility.
There's no real rehabilitation. There's not even a goal of rehabilitation. It's just lock them up, keep them away for a few years, and then somehow, they expect you to be cured of whatever it was that you went to prison for, and you're not.
This environment doesn't nurture pro-social behavior, doesn't nurture that type of, mentality or behavior. It really nurtures you to be the thug, the gangster, the killer, because those guys in this environment get the most respect.
For Dante, the road to redemption was not straight. In 2002, he attacked another prisoner in what he says was self-defense and had 2 to 4 more years added to his sentence.
I'm not a model prisoner. I'm not perfect, and I've had issues, disciplinary issues, adjustment issues. I accept all that. I grew up in here though. This is where I reached my maturity. I became an adult in prison. What did you expect? You gotta be insane to want this, and what this imposes upon your character. Who wants to go back into society and come back to prison? Who wants that? And it's kind of sad, because you would think that any rational person would say, I don't, I want to do better. But a lot of guys are not going out there with the skills to be able to succeed. And I realized that this institutions, they don't provide that. So I had to provide it for myself.
Now Dante says he spends his free time in the law library, takes college courses, and mentors younger prisoners.
There's a couple 18-year-olds under my tutelage right now. There's one kid, he's like a firecracker. He's just, but he's easily influenced by all the negativity. Like, he feels like, I gotta be the tough guy. But imagine if you separate him from this environment where he doesn't feel the need to be the tough guy. What would he do then? What could he aspire to? Because he's a very, pretty bright, intelligent kid. But sometimes escaping this reality, it's not easy.
He's a credible person to talk to young people because he's been there. He's been in their situation before.
Whether they recognize it or not, he has rehabilitated himself. He's not the guy that's going to come out here and commit crimes. He's the guy that's going to come out here and try to make a difference.
While Dante has been incarcerated, new research has found that our brains are not fully developed into our early 20s. Researchers say that means teenagers are more susceptible to peer pressure, less risk averse, and more likely to be persuaded by their environment. Two Supreme Court rulings, Roper v. Simmons in 2005 and then Graham v. Florida in 2010, took into account this brain science when ruling it unconstitutional to give juveniles the death sentence or life without possibility of parole. They argue that for offenders under 18, a state must impose a sentence that provides some meaningful opportunity for release based on demonstrated maturity and rehabilitation. New York has made small steps to update their treatment of juveniles. In 2017, Governor Andrew Cuomo signed Raise the Age legislation that raises the age of criminal responsibility for nonviolent crimes from 16 and 17 to 18 years old. This new policy does not affect Dante's case, and he feels it does not go far enough.
You got 18-year-old kids here now that don't belong here. Honestly, I think until you maybe turn 21, you shouldn't be surrounded by this environment. You have to do more for the youth that are coming in and for the guys such as myself who've already did time.
We need to do a lot more in terms of raising the age. There are places that are trying to raise the age to 21, 24, trying to follow the science. I think we're asking the wrong question about focusing on this age. We should be talking about what do the facilities look like that we send people to, and what are we doing in there while we have young people there.
Dante is now suing Governor Cuomo and the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, arguing that they have not developed meaningful rehabilitative treatment for juvenile offenders with long prison sentences. With 6 more years in his sentence, Dante has applied to the governor's office for early release through clemency.
What does that 6 years really mean to us when we've got 20? That 6 years doesn't really mean anything to us anymore. It means the world to Dante. Like tomorrow means the world to Dante.
I just want him to be free. I think he served his time.
In New York State, it costs $60,000 per year to house, feed, and guard a prisoner. That means over the past 21 years, the state has spent $1.2 million on Dante's incarceration.
I'm more of an asset out there than I am in here. I learned the lesson that I needed to learn. I've learned it.
I wish I. We have to talk quietly because the press gaggle is still going on. So I can't be my full Brooklyn self with you all right now. I don't want people just sitting. I got to be dialed back a little bit, which is taking an extraordinary amount of work. I hope you see the work I'm putting in here today just to be quiet. How are you feeling? How is that first opening session? Yeah? Inspired? Feel ready for the next session? We're going to talk, we're going to hear from one of our colleagues who's been doing this work a long time, and then we're going to go to Tom Steyer. And I want to say something out of love for my brother Bruce. I actually can't insert questions, that come up, and they will come up during the candidate interviews. They're sort of preset, not scripted, but preset. If I could, I would. And so I want you to hold those questions, because whether you ask them in this room is less important than if you ask them at home, and figure out how you're going to keep pressing those questions at home. And also, please remember, if there are questions that you want answers to, questions that you feel need to be out there and put before the public, please do so on any of your social channels using the hashtag #JusticeVotes2020. Keep this conversation going. Keep this dialogue going, because you know how it is. This is important to many of us, all of us, and many people who are not here. But there are others who say they're committed, and then tomorrow it'll be something else, right? So we have to keep pushing this question out there. But I'm trying to kill time because we don't have the signal yet. Do we have a favorite moment yet, Hamdia? Thank you so much. And let me welcome back everybody who is watching us across 20 states and 130 at least viewing parties. It's been an incredible morning. And so I want to turn now and ask you to remember to hashtag #JusticeVotes2020 as you're hearing the things that the candidates are saying, that formerly incarcerated people are saying, the questions they asked, what resonates, that made sense. Elevate that. If you have other questions, put them out there on your social channels so people can hear them. But right now I have the distinct honor of introducing to all of you a young woman. Well, I guess that we're not babies anymore, but we look good. We look good.
Yes, we do.
But I have the distinct honor of bringing to the stage a woman I first met when I was an editor at Essence Magazine. Her story resonated with all of us, a young college student in Virginia, the victim of domestic violence and domestic assaults, whose partner was involved in street activity. She was swept up in that and sentenced to nearly 25 years in prison because there was a groundswell. The power of the people. She, along with another woman about that time, Dorothy Gaines in Alabama, who had gotten 19 years and 6 months because people demanded it, were released from prison much earlier. They never should have been in prison, but they were released from prison much earlier. Kemba did more than 6 years in the federal system. And so this wife, this mother of two beautiful ones, I can't believe that one is 25. I can't believe we grew these babies up. This wonder who has used her voice every day not to hide from what happened to her, but to elevate what happens to women who are survivors of violence, women who are in the system, to talk to young people across the nation. She hasn't faltered one day, hasn't failed one day, and that's why she's here with us. My friend, my sister, my beloved, Kemba Smith. Please join us on stage.
Wow. So this is us. Justice Votes 2020, Eastern State Penitentiary. And I am humbled and honored to be here. But just before I was born, a couple of months before I was born, President Nixon declared the war on drugs. And I grew up as a little girl, my parents' only child, and went through life successfully. And then when I went to college, as it was explained, I ended up loving a human being who was in some street activity. But as a first-time nonviolent drug offender, I was sentenced to 24 and a half years in federal prison. And so for me, that experience, I couldn't actually believe it, because when I turned myself in, I was actually 7 months pregnant. And the prosecutor had assured my attorney that if I turned myself in, that he would grant me a bond to give birth to my son. And he also said that if I turned myself in and if I pled guilty, that I would receive 24-month sentence. And he reneged on both of those promises, which was prosecutorial misconduct. So there I was sitting in federal prison, 7 months pregnant, and having to give birth to my first child. And when I would go to my weekly visits, as was discussed earlier, I was handcuffed, shackled, and taken to a clinic every week where people were staring at me like I was a public spectacle, wondering what kind of crime did I commit, where I felt not human anymore. And so I ended up giving birth to my son. And one of the things that I'm most passionate about, as was discussed earlier as well, is the fact that after I gave birth to my son, 5 minutes after I gave birth to him, my leg had to be handcuffed and shackled to the bed. And after my 2-day hospital stay, I had to go back to county jail where there was no physical contact. What kind of country do we live in where a woman can give birth and not be a threat to public safety, and you not let them have human contact with that child, which I didn't have human contact with him until after I was transferred to federal prison. And this is one of the things that Senator Harris spoke about. I was transferred to federal prison over 2,000 miles away from my child in California. And so luckily, I have two fantastic, wonderful parents that loved me unconditionally, that saved enough money to come visit me in California so I could be reunited with my son. But I was released from federal prison in December 2000. Understand, I turned myself in 1994. I received a 23-and-a-half-year sentence, and I wasn't supposed to be released until January of 2016. Fortunately, I was released after President Clinton commuted my sentence after having served 6.5 years. I did not have a Kim Kardashian that could go to the President of the United States. There was an actual movement that had to take place on the grassroots level where the NAACP Legal Defense Fund represented me pro bono. And I'm going back to the fact that they represented me for free, not because they felt sorry for poor little Kemba or because they felt sorry for my parents. They represented me because the fastest growing population at the time were black women, and they had hoped that my case would set a precedent for others with this war on drugs, which is more so a war on people of black and brown color. And so ever since my release and being released from prison in December 2000, I've been committed to continue to bring a human face. And I need people to understand across this country and nation the importance of highlighting our stories, making us human, because I know that's what moved a nation to advocate for my release. But too much is given, much is required. And so we are here in this space. And I'm so grateful that I was invited to speak. But understand, in 2000, when I was released, there was no criminal justice real movement. And so I am disappointed. I'm grateful for the candidates that are here today to have this conversation. But I am disappointed in the other candidates, because we've come to a place of President Obama where I'm grateful for what he did. He could have done more. He released over 1,700 people from commutations, which is what I received. And then we moved into this era of Trump, and there have been some successes. But my goodness, I came out of prison almost 20 years ago. I still have a friend who is incarcerated in federal prison, Michelle West, who's a first-timer who has a life sentence. This is real for me and for us. The reason why I will continue to speak out and to share my story where most grown people wouldn't want to talk about this traumatic experience, and we're here in this prison, and we know, this is us, formerly FIP people, we know just how traumatic it is to walk through that gate. But we're going to do what we need to do to let our voices be heard and change policies. But also, too, one of the things that, and I know you all heard me say this thing, nonviolent. Violence or no violent, nonviolence should not matter. Understand that in what I do, I talk to young people about making healthy choices and not going down the same path. How do you think that people can actually impact young people out there today? We need some of the people that have violent offenses to be out here on the ground doing this work and helping to change the lives, because those kids that are out on the street committing crimes, they're not going to listen to programming or somebody talking about how they're in corporate America doing XYZ. They need to hear it from us on the ground with the stories and making healthy choices and preventing this school to prison pipeline. So I want to share with us in this celebration of having this conversation and continuing the movement. And thank you all so very much.
Don't you step off that stage, Kemba. That's Kemba Smith. Kemba Smith.
Thank you.
She stood without falter and without fail and just did that brilliance in 7 minutes. Thank you, Kemba. Thank you. And she also set me up so brilliantly. This is what it is when you're just sisters and you flow. But
I'm sorry, one thing I'll have to mention also too, we need to be in this space and being able to impact, and Virginia appointed me to the Virginia Parole Board, and that's something I want to encourage others to advocate. All these listening parties understand that we can be in positions of power where we can have true impact.
Kemba Smith. And so I think we are going to reset this stage. Maybe should I step over here? Okay, I'm going to step back over here. Thank you so much. And Kemba just set us up beautifully as she talked about who needs to be on the ground and doing the training, because the next person I'm going to bring up has been leading people across the nation in extraordinary campaigns, working with people who've been formerly incarcerated, doing as Andrea says, and making sure people are educated and have the skills to advocate for their own selves in their own voice. And when they say nothing about us without us, they can say that in true meaning. Please join me in welcoming Deanna Hoskins, who is going to help us lead this next part of the conversation, with Ari Melber and the 2020 presidential candidate, Tom Steyer, who is devoted and committed to giving half of his funds in this lifetime, made the giving pledge in order to ensure we do truly have a more perfect union. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Give a warm welcome to Tom Steyer, our second candidate today, and as mentioned, Deanna Hoskins. We're going to use the same format. I'm going to briefly welcome everyone, and then Deanna's going to ask the first question, and we'll get out to the audience. Thank you for doing this, sir.
It's really my pleasure.
When I was watching the program earlier this morning, I did hear some Chuck D. I did. I heard some Drake, Canada's favorite rapper. But I've resisted doing anything until now, but I can't help it.
Oh, no. Are you about to rap?
No, I don't rap, but I do listen, and after you listen, you can quote, and when you listen, you learn. So what I listened to was Sean Carter, who came from nothing, Jay-Z, who famously said, if money talks, the whole world is about to hear me out. And that's definitely the case with this guy. He has a lot of money.
Yes.
But by way of introduction, he says he's here not because of his money, but rather he's been trying to spend it to do things, and now has vaunted himself up onto the presidential stage, and he's made the debates. So again, because I'm a reporter, I try to say true things. I don't think Mr. Steyer is the most famous candidate or the most well-known on these issues, but I could tell you one thing that differentiates him from some other candidates. He's here with you today.
That's right. Come on.
Let's see if I can say I'm different in some other ways, too, over the next half hour.
So that's my introduction, and we'll continue with the format we've been using. Looking forward to audience questions, which means, sir, as I've done with each candidate, I will at times move you along to make sure we have time for that, and I turn it to Deanna for the first question.
Thank you, Ari. Thank you, Tom, for being here in this setting. This setting really sets the stage of the reality of what the individuals in this room have experienced. So I want to thank you for showing up for us and centering our leadership and our voices.
Look, I said it was my pleasure, but it really is my responsibility and my duty.
Yes, thank you. So you've been extremely successful in business. You've devoted most of your time to climate change and a campaign to impeach the current president. But you still showed up to talk to us about ending mass incarceration. What about us, and what is so important about today that you're here, and why have you chosen to prioritize directly impacted people?
So let me give you a little bit of history of my family and me in terms of incarceration. My mother was a teacher in the New York public schools, but she taught reading at the Brooklyn House of Detention by choice, because she felt that helping the incarcerated people there learn while they were inside was something that would prepare them for once they were returned to society. Second of all, my wife has been involved for a long time in a project of rehabilitation at San Quentin, which is the local federal penitentiary near our house, in terms of rehabilitation for incarcerated felons. Lastly, let me say this. I know it sounds from this introduction as if I haven't worked on this, but I've worked very hard to end cash bail in California, my home state, and we actually did end cash bail.
Yes.
I've also worked to end automatic sentence enhancements, the equivalent of mandatory minimums in the state of California, which has happened. So in fact, this is something where this is not my first rodeo, if you will. That I understand when I was looking at how to reduce the prison population by 50%, I could look and see that in the 4 major places I had worked seriously and thought about them in my campaign reflects all of them.
Yes. So I want to follow up because as I was kind of doing my research, when you were kicking off your campaign, you said that the power needs to be returned to the people. But when you're in a room of people who never had that power, so how do you give something or return something that we've never had to be stripped? Because we've been the most marginalized population in society, as we know slavery involved into mass incarceration. So how, as president, how do you give us power that we've never had?
So I completely accept that point, Deanna, that this country started with massive, deliberate, legalized injustice and racism. And it's been a path towards justice. It's the journey that's been positive, not the start. But the way that I believe in giving power to the people on every issue, including this one, is to make sure that the people who are closest to the ground, who are most involved with the problem, have leadership positions in formulating and executing policy. And so you can't do that 30,000 foot direct what goes on the ground. You have to start on the ground with the people most involved, because otherwise you're not going to get all the information and nuance you need to have fair policy. So when you ask, how do you return policy? I take your point. It's getting power to people who may never have had it before. And that's exactly why we've had such unjust policies to begin with.
I've got some follow-ups, but I'm going to turn first to the audience. We have Bruce Riley here for our first audience question, and we heard from you earlier on the panel about some of your experience. Bruce, please go ahead.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for being here. My name is Bruce Riley. I'm the Deputy Director of Voters Organized to Educate from down in New Orleans, Louisiana. And my question to you is that, roughly 500,000 prison guards, hundreds of thousands of other prison staff work in mostly rural towns that often lack few other employment options. Meanwhile, there's millions of police, sheriffs, bailiffs, and others who work in often urban areas that arrest and convict the people that get sent to those urban towns. And of course, there's a racial dynamic to this as well. And then there's also the corporations that are profiting off every aspect of this cycle, from food to transportation to phone calls. So it's a really big industry. And you're a businessman. Do you worry that this industry is too big to fail?
So Bruce, let me say this. The whole thesis of my running for president is that corporations have bought the government. And that the decisions are made to enhance their profit lines and their bottom lines at the expense of the American people. And I don't doubt for a second that there is a lot of pressure put on legislators and executives in the government to actually make sure that the school to prison pipeline is alive and well. But if there's ever a case where you can see that the interests of human beings are so far ahead of the profit line of any corporation. And so, do I understand that there are dollars at stake? Of course I do. In California, just so you guys know, my home state's California, it's $84,000 to keep someone in prison for a year. We spend $14,000 on a kid K through 12. So if you think how much we could afford to spend to keep those kids in school, how much we could afford to support them in every way that you can support kids, and have it be better for them, better for their families, better for their communities, better for the state, and better for the country. So do I understand that money talks? I think so. But do I understand that the lives of human beings, specifically young human beings, have got to be the only choice of any kind of president or leader or community member? Yeah, I get that too. That's why I'm running for president.
So you're talking about pushing back against what can be the malicious impact of profit industries here. Because we're in a room full of people who are directly impacted and a lot of experts, everyone knows CCA, right? And you had a hedge fund that invested in CCA, which means you were a company trying to profit off that. Now, we know from our research, you've publicly said that was a mistake and that you sought to end it. So given that you've already spoken to that, I guess the question in this room is, what needs to happen so that it's not just people after the fact, after the investment's made and profit may be made, when there's pressure or when there's a political campaign taking it back, what needs to happen, given your expertise in that field, so that people like you and your hedge fund don't make those investments in the first place?
Well, look, we did buy it, and I thought about it for a couple months, and I just thought it was wrong. I wasn't running for president. I was running for anything. I just thought about, is it right? There was an argument about how this could be done more effectively, and I thought, absolutely wrong. And I sold it. Not because of pressure, not because I was just a private citizen. I decided that is a wrong thing to do to profit from someone being in jail.
Well, let me push you on that a little bit, sir, because you're describing a process where it was bought and then afterward you thought about it. Now, tell me if I'm wrong. My job is just asking the questions, but my understanding is a lot of folks in finance, the way they make their money is by thinking about the investment beforehand, not afterward.
So let me say this. The only question here was, is it proper? And I spend a lot of time talking to people in the community and people on the board of the company to get their argument for why it was or wasn't. And I was unsure, and after a couple months I wasn't unsure because I kept investigating. So my only concern with this was, is there a way to justify this in terms of doing better service? And I decided there isn't. And so, not as a result of people giving me a hard time, because I actually did the work and was only worried about right and wrong, I sold it and decided I've come to my own decision. I made a mistake in the first place. I listened to some people. I was wrong. And now I've continued to go. I talked to a bunch of activists to explain to me, how do you see this? How do you look at it? And I realized this is just wrong. And so I sold it. And I've always felt like, boy, I was really dumb. I regret it. It was a mistake. And so I corrected it on my own.
So I want to follow up and push a little bit more on what Ari talked about. So we know organizations such as CCA, GO are actually the facility of private prison industry. But that is only 9% of the private industrial prison complex. So we have,
Is that right?
Yes. So we have the food service, we have the phones, we have the medical care. You actually have the uniforms, the linens, and actually the fixtures that go in. So when we talk about ending private prisons, that's easy because that's only 10% of the private industry that's profiting from us. So when you look at all the other parts, I'm going to go back to Bruce's question. Is this a corporation that's too big to fail?
Look, it's not too big to fail, but it takes a fight to win. And so that's my whole point with these guys. If we don't fight them, they will win. I'm running saying we have to beat the corporations. Honestly, Deanna, this is a perfect example, but so is the healthcare industry, you know, where there are drug companies selling basically to the United States government and charging whatever they want. So is the defense industry. You know, basically what I'm fighting for is for the government to try and serve the people in this room if they're looking at an 18-year-old kid, that their concern is that kid, his family, her family, their community, the country. Not whether what happens to them is going to profit a corporation. So do I think that they're too big to fail? No. But do I think they're too big to fail unless we take them on? Heck yes. I know that, and that's why I'm running, really. I'm running because unless someone takes them on, they're going to keep going. And there's no question about it, and they're going to do it every part of society, and everybody in the United States knows it too, is they bought the government, and no one really stands up to them and fights them.
We're going to go out to another audience question from Lawrence Bartley. Lawrence, thank you, sir.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Bartley. I'm the director of News Inside for the Marshall Project, which is a national news organization that is headquartered in New York. We report on criminal justice news. Now, over the last few years, one of the causes of mass incarceration is the increased number of sentences, particularly within the last 4 decades. Now, those who write laws, they have not only increased the maximum number of years of a sentence, but they have also established mandatory minimums. Now, I just heard you mention that you worked for sentencing reform for mandatory minimums in your home state. But as president and on a national level, will you continue your work to reform mandatory minimums? And what would you do about maximum sentences for everyone?
So, Lawrence, what I did in California and what I believe about these mandatory minimums and automatic sentence enhancements is I'm opposed to them. I think what we've seen, what happens with them, is that people very far removed take away any discretion from judges to take into account human factors and a decision about what's best. So would I, as president, push hard to oppose those things? Absolutely. I think the other thing that's been true, and you can see it in terms specifically of clemency, that there are people who've been in jail for very long periods of time. There are people who've been in jail for very long periods of time for things we no longer even think are criminal in parts of the country. And there are people who've been in jail very long periods of time who are old or sick. So in fact, do I understand that some of these maximum sentences make no sense over time and should be reviewed? Yes, I do.
So just to follow up to that, we know as president, your actual jurisdiction is over the federal level.
Yes.
So, and mass incarceration is really occurring on a state level. So my question is, we know the 94 crime bill incentivized states to build prisons, which kind of accelerated us to this point we're at, to build truth in sentencing and to incorporate mandatory minimums. So for me, I'm very curious as president, are you willing to be bold and courageous to not only say we're going to repeal the 94 crime bill, but we're actually going to incentivize states to decarcerate?
Look, let's stop for 1 second about this, about how we're seeing this, or how I'm seeing this, Deanna. Look, there's no way to talk about the criminal justice system without talking about race. Yes. And there's no way to think about the justice of this, the morality of this, the importance of this without talking about racism. So when you ask me, am I willing to do that? I said at the beginning, I feel like it's my duty to be here. I feel like it would be my duty specifically to go after those kinds of things, because the concept of incarceration without rehabilitation, the idea of taking people, putting them in prison and throwing away the key, is something that was very, very wrong. And as a society, if we do something that's very, very wrong, then it's important to turn the page, to say it was wrong, and do the opposite. So when I look at this, do I think that I will do that? I think you have to do that if you want to turn the page on an extreme act of racism by the country.
Thank you.
I want to ask you more about your business record. Well, we heard from one of your fellow candidates earlier, Senator Harris. We talked a lot about her record as a prosecutor, which a lot of experts and observers feel cuts both ways. A lot of your record is in business, so I say that by way of context and explanation. Can you recall in business hiring an ex-convict?
Well, let me say,
Language, all right.
previously incarcerated.
Well, previously incarcerated or a former felon, but as a reporter, I use all those terms. Well, I appreciate the point, but we do use all those terms.
So
I hear you, and we're hearing from you, and we're also hearing from journalists. So I appreciate both.
Let me make a couple points. I don't recall it. We'd never asked the question. There's some rules in terms of securities regulations that I'm sure we were following, Ari. But let me say this. Am I in favor, let me just answer your question. Am I in favor of banning the box so that question can't be accurately answered? Yes, I am. Because in fact, one of the things that we're talking about previously incarcerated people is, have they in fact paid their debt to society, and do we want them to reestablish their lives as full citizens of the United States? So I know that includes being hired. It means being eligible for government programs. It means really being allowed to vote. There is a real question here about, have you paid your debt to society? The answer is yes. So in fact, the answer to your question is, I don't know. But I'm sure we were following securities regulations, and I honestly don't know what they are. But I will say this, it is really important in our society. And you can, look, I'm from California. We had some really, really bad recidivism rates. That argues in my mind really strongly for strong rehabilitation programs while people are incarcerated. It involves yes, exactly, lack of jobs. It involves connections with pipelines actually to employment afterwards. And it involves actually recognizing that people need support in reentering society and having a place to go and a program so they can understand how they can be productive members of society again.
And so how would you apply that if you're running the government, if you're president? In other words, given the business expertise that you have and the interest people have in saying, okay, whatever happens to someone, if they return to society, it's better for everyone, for the community, for their families, for safety, for security, all the things, that they are actually able to go out and get a job and participate. And so given your business acumen, above and beyond your personal experience, how do you apply that as president? How do you make sure that that changes if this is something that you want to work on?
Look, when I've talked to people about what works in terms of putting people in a position to have a real job and a straightforward program and a plan for when they come out. And to me, the question is, can you provide training that's specifically relevant for a job, and can you provide connections so you have a place to go to get that job? And so to me, establishing both the programs of training and the connections is something that the government can do. And I'll give you an example of something that I saw that really moved me. I was in Nevada, and I was having lunch with a woman who ran a school for cosmetologists. And she'd been hired to go into the local women's prison to teach people to become cosmetologists while they were inside and to actually get them a certificate after they came out. The state stopped paying her, but she kept going. And I said, really? So you're doing it for free now? And she said, once you start doing that, you can't stop. And so in fact, the women came out with skills, with a certificate, and with a connection to somebody who placed people all over the state. And I looked at that and I said, boy, that woman impressed the heck out of me. She was doing something really important. She was giving people a path. She was doing it out of the goodness of her heart, let's be accurate. And it was an important thing, and she was hiring a bunch of the women. So I look at that, Ari, and I say, I've talked to a bunch of people, including one in Compton, California last week, about how to do this. And that, to me, is a model for what we need. Training, some kind of certification, and a connection. So that when you come out, you're not just wondering, what the heck do I do?
So to kind of go a little bit more on that, one of the things we know that we talked about the discriminatory practices for individuals once they leave prison or incarceration around basic human needs, housing, employment, and different things. But in any other world, we have actually provided protective class status for individuals once we know they've been outright discriminated against. So as president, is when you look at a protected class, and we know that this discriminatory practice goes on around with formerly incarcerated, around our housing needs, around employment, around getting financial resources to even purchase houses, cars, and different things of that nature. What are your thoughts on formerly incarcerated or directly impacted people becoming a protected class?
Well, Deanna, let me ask you a question, because let me see if I'm right in my assumptions. Look, I think people are still, formerly incarcerated people are still being discriminated against actively when they come out. So the first step we have to do is make sure that they have the full rights of citizens, of American citizens, including access to American programs, you know, the ability to get public housing, the ability to not to have to disclose that on applications for jobs, the ability to get jobs, in particular to not be prevented from getting jobs based on their having been inside before.
Right.
So that's the first step. I know you're asking me a different question, but I'm saying the first thing we need to do is end the discrimination. Then the second question is, what can we do to make sure that in fact we give those people a chance, you know, a real chance at rehabilitation and a new start? And that is something which, if you look at the cost to specific communities, to African American and Latino communities of this policy over the last 40 years, the explosion of incarceration. If you look at that and think about what the cost has been specifically to communities, but more broadly to this country, I think we absolutely should have, and this is an answer to your question, a directed effort to try and undo the costs of that failed and unfair and racist program.
But I still want to know.
I understand your point, but here's my question, and here's the answer to your question, Deanna. What does a protected class mean? Because what I'm saying is I will devote resources. I will make sure that people get specific attention to make sure that they get aid so that when they're coming out, it is rehabilitation with a program to get into, a plan to get into being a productive citizen with a chance not just put out on the street with no plans. Right. So what does being a protected class specifically mean?
Protected class means once I apply for housing and my record is the blockage of me getting that housing. Because having worked in federal government,
so is this someone who's just coming out?
Yes. Having worked in federal government, I realize and understand that the federal government only bars 2 criminal records from public housing. All of the rules are locally implemented, but we can't overstep them because they're the locally implemented rules. Therefore, if I can't get a basic human need, I leave prison, you tell me go out, be successful. For one, I was traumatized prior to getting to the judge, got in front of the judge, got sentenced to prison, traumatized, and you push me out the door and say go be successful, and nobody addressed my trauma, and I have no basic human needs. Almost as the system pushing me back into a survival mode because I have no protectors to ensure that I can get housing, access to services, or even employment. But other populations do, and I'm going to
So give me an example of a protected class.
That's what I like. So there was a baker who refused to bake a cake for a wedding of a gay couple, was sued and different things of that nature. But when people refuse to give us housing, employment, we don't have the option to sue.
Previously incarcerated.
Right. to protect ourselves that you're still discriminating against us. But
So let me explain that to me. How is it possible that someone can refuse to treat you as a full citizen of America?
right, because
How is
that's-
that legal?
Because slavery never went away. It evolved into mass incarceration. So the oppression is still there. So this is and I'm saying this because this is the reality. So here's the catch. There's actually a clause in the Civil Rights Act that says you cannot outright discriminate against a disparate population. Right. So when you have job postings that say, or apartments that say, no felons allowed, no criminal background, you are outright discriminating against African Americans and Latinas. But the courts don't protect us when we take those cases to court.
Okay, would I fight against that? Absolutely.
Yes.
That's not right.
Okay.
I mean, that's not a close call.
Okay.
So look, I said when you come back, you are a full member of society. And that includes no one can discriminate against you. I mean, you're asking me the question in terms of the gay couple where the baker refused to bake them a cake for their wedding. Right. Yeah, that's wrong. And what you're describing is wrong too. You can't say that to full American citizens. So if you're asking me, do you have the protections of a full American citizen? Yes.
Right. And
absolutely.
I don't want it to be in theory. We want it.
No. You can't. Okay. I mean, and the point is, the federal government has got to ensure the rights of American citizens. Look, I said this country started with legalized injustice and slavery in the Constitution. And it's been a journey away from injustice towards justice. What you're describing is injustice. An American citizen is prevented from renting an apartment, getting a house, participating in a program. On what basis?
And just watching this exchange, it's fascinating. Who asked the question and who we learn from helps determine the answer. So I think what we have here is a good faith exchange where we're actually engaging the content and the information and learning and then getting a position out of you, which now is on the public record. So,
but Ari, let me make a point. I started this
we've been letting you make points.
I started this by saying the way you get the right policy is to go to the community that's affected and get their experience, their wisdom. And that's exactly what Deanna is saying to me is, Tom, did you know someone puts a listing that says no one who's got a criminal record can come here? And I said, no. So and you said, is that right? I said, no. Right. And that's exactly my point about how you should do policy. You've got to get down to the community, to the people who live it, whose families live it, and see exactly how it works at the most, 2 inches from the ground, so you get it right. And that's my goal.
So appreciate both of you for that. My job as moderator is to remind us we're about 2 minutes out. I know your schedule's busy like everyone else's. Number one, we want to afford you the same opportunity we've afforded other candidates, which is a final thought if you want to give one. And I'll also end on one other question, which is we've talked a lot about these issues here. One of the things that distinguished you early on among the Democratic or liberal leaders was over a year ago saying Donald Trump has acted in ways that are lawless and should be impeached. And in the reporting we do, we said 2 years ago, we interview a lot of people, including a lot of respected liberal leaders who weren't there. It seems, big picture, that the Democratic Party and the Congress has moved towards you on that position. And so because we are talking about law and order and how the rules apply, I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to that. Any thoughts you have on that? Is it because of you or is it coincidental? Because you spent millions of dollars and advocated on that and other issues. And also, as I mentioned with other candidates, any final thought you want to share with us before we lose you?
So let me ask you guys a question. Is there anyone in this room who doesn't think Donald Trump should be impeached? Thank you. Look, what I was trying to do was say what you guys knew was true, that people in D.C. weren't willing to say was true because they thought it was bad for their careers. And that was, he's a crook. He also happens to be a racist, but he more than met the criteria to be impeached. And I said from the beginning, listen to the American people. They know he's a crook. He should be thrown out. So let's talk about justice for 1 second. What Deanna and I were talking about was justice for human beings. That people deserve justice. If there's racism involved, it's got to be called out and it's got to be redressed. Mr. Trump is the flip side of that coin. He believes because he's rich and powerful that he doesn't have to obey the law. Yeah. And so it's not, and white, absolutely. And it's not right. And that's why I was saying, no. One law for the people of the United States.
And
there is, it
just
is
echoing that, only jumping in, just to make sure people heard on the mic. So the question from the audience was, and is it part of the fact that he's white? Would a black president have been treated differently by this point?
Oh my God. Does anyone in this room think that President Obama could have done any of the things this man has done? And he wouldn't have, oh my gosh, of course it's unfair. Look, there is an assumption, you guys love privilege. There is an assumption of privilege here that is so deep and so offensive and so wrong. By him, his assumption of privilege. That he's assuming he's privileged to be above the law. He's this, the exact flip side of what we were just talking about. That does someone have a right to rent an apartment? Yes. And that for him, does he also have the obligation to obey the laws that all of us have to obey? Yes. And that's why I did it. Because there's a right and wrong. And when power and privilege says we're above the law, then the answer is no, you're not. And when people feel like they're not being treated fairly under the law, then we all need to stand up and say, yes, you are, and make it happen. And that is the point why impeachment is just the flip side of mass incarceration to me, including race. And you're absolutely right. It's right in there.
Please join me in thanking Tom Steyer and Deanna Hoskins.
Can someone, can you hear me?
It's the strangest thing in the world to me. I was telling the officers the truth, and they took my words and they twisted it. I said, I'm gonna go to the cops, and I'm gonna tell them what I saw, and I'll be home before my mom gets back. I came home 7 years later. My name is Yusef Salaam. I'm one of the Central Park Five. We were in the park, and there was a lot of things that people were doing, a lot of mischief making, people throwing rocks at cars, harassing people. The things that I saw that night should have given me an indication to leave. The next day, I was told that police officers were looking for me. And they kept asking me, okay, tell us about the jogger. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. And then it began, okay, tell us your story all over again. There were over 400 articles written, and all of these articles were pulling apart our lives. Donald Trump took out full-page ads in New York City's newspapers calling for the reinstatement of the death penalty, specifically for our case. In my trial, they said Yusef Salaam doesn't have a written or videotaped confession, but the others do. This is what some of the others has said about his involvement, and as a result of that, I was convicted. They sent me up to a place called Harlem Valley. We were there for a crime that we didn't commit. And here we were looking at officers. They looked like bodybuilders. Some of them had tattoos of black and brown babies with nooses around their necks on their arms. It was almost like a signal, like I'm not gonna tell you how bad it's gonna be. Just look at my tattoos. Get out of line and we will bury you up here. When I came home from prison, I was branded a rapist. For years, I would be walking around in this fog and, just trying to put one foot in front of the other and figure life out again. And then 13 years later, the truth comes out in the most amazing way. When the police found out about Matias Reyes's story, about the facts that he told them, they knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that he raped the Central Park jogger. And when they finally said that they were dropping the charges, it was the happiest day of my life. Nelson Mandela said, being angry, being bitter is like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to die. It doesn't do anything to the person. It does everything to you. But I'm still haunted. Being free is free. Like, you're free from all of the things that held you back. I'm not free like that.
I've been getting letters from the jailhouse ever since I can remember. My mom, cousins, uncles, nephews have been incarcerated. My mind sometimes just made me feel like I was in prison with them. My mother was in and out of prison and jail, and she wasn't able to take care of me, so that led me into a foster family. I wrote poetry, and the poetry that I would write, it would all end up being about drugs or jail, the same things that my family was surrounded by. Even though I haven't been incarcerated myself, it would sometimes become so overwhelming just trying to be there for all of my loved ones. My brothers still are incarcerated. I would never turn my backs on them, but I think I'm ready for another phase in my life. When I found out I was having a baby girl, I wasn't as scared. Hi, Mama. She has more of a chance of not being incarcerated because of me. Hi, Mama. Hi, Mama. I pray to God and I ask God to let this be a healing process for me to get through some of my old wounds.
Dear Treasure, sis, it's your brother.
Hey, Treasure girl.
I just want what's best for my sister. I just learned my son died and my eyes are starting to burn because of so many tears. Every day I just want to come home and be with my kids. All right, sis, I love you. Love Junior.
Love, Mom. I just wanted to help other families to be able to see that you can still move past that.
I agree. Our viewers are most curious to hear about your story.
Well, I've been getting letters from the jailhouse ever since I can remember. And she explained to me that my brother got life in prison. And I asked her what that meant. She said, Treasure, your brother ain't getting out of jail. I wish I could just say hi. Hi to my loved ones that are now serving time. This cycle of life continues as more loved ones I know do time.
I got so much off my mind and off my heart. I felt like I could just exhale. Like it was just like, and if we can help another family by doing this, then that's why we should be doing it.
I
just pray I don't become a bitter woman. I had often said in the beginning, I didn't sign up for this life. You know, this is the life someone else gets. My name is Julie Anderson, and my son Eric has served 23 and a half years in prison, and as his mother, I have served that time alongside him. I grew up on the southwest side of Chicago. It was a working class neighborhood. My husband became a Chicago police officer. We got married and we started our family. And I kind of had a plan. My kids would go to college, which is something I didn't do, and they would buy houses down the block from me and have my grandkids, and that would be it. When Eric started high school, he kind of changed friends, his group of friends. He started skipping school, and it was a real battle. He was involved with these kids, and they were in a gang. The Almighty Popes was their name. And he was forbidden from seeing any of those friends, but, you know, when you go out to work or whatever, it's hard to forbid 15-year-olds from doing anything. December 15th, 1995, Eric was with 2 other gang members. They had stolen a gun out of a policewoman's house. She left her door open, and she left a loaded gun on the table. That night, there was a van that had been coming in the neighborhood, I guess, that they didn't want in there. And Eric and these 2 other guys, Eric had the gun, and he shot into this van from across a park about 300 feet away in December, 5:30 at night, and struck and killed 2 girls inside the van. I had heard about the shooting, but didn't imagine that, you know, he was involved. Although it did kind of scare me because I knew they were running around doing things that they shouldn't do. So at 4 in the morning, we got a knock on our door, and it was the police to take Eric away. They got him up and put his jacket on, and there were a few words exchanged. They checked my husband's guns, which they were all accounted for. And that was the last time he's been home. The trial lasted 4 days. He had 6 co-defendants. He was 15, and the oldest one was 23. All of the victim family members went, which is difficult. You're just filled with so much shame and guilt, and they're sitting on the other side of the aisle, and you don't even know what to do or how to even look at them, and it was really pretty horrible, traumatic. I don't think I realized how physically painful something like that could be. The whole world was over. I couldn't believe it. Prison is such a bad place in the United States and in Illinois. You wouldn't want anyone you care about to even spend one night in there. Eric spent most of his time in Menard Prison, which is 365 miles from my front door. He was allowed 5 visits a month, so my husband and I, between us, made sure we visited 5 times a month. For years, and this is a terrible thing for a mom to say, but I had to pray that my son would die before I did, because who would take care of him if I was gone? Do I leave that to his sister or his brother? So it was always I don't know, you can't outlive me because there'll be no one. And people who are in prison without anyone, it's a really hard road for them. when Eric was resentenced, he gave an allocution and apologized to those family members for his part. I was able to get on the stand and tell them how much I deeply regretted it and how their daughters are always on my mind, as did my husband. If I could give them back their daughters, I would. And I can only think that if Eric were to get out, he owes a debt to those families. In fact, trying to save a kid from going down that path and trying to save another family from the pain that they've suffered and we've suffered.
Looking at all these Philly people trying to give me something. My pleasure to now introduce you to the third and last discussion that we will have with candidates today, that we will be led in conversation. We will be led in conversation by Ari Melber, again, and also the brilliant Daryl Atkinson, who's the first Second Chance Fellow who served in the Department of Justice under Loretta Lynch, but most importantly has dedicated himself to ensuring that his community is empowered, is working, can elect a next prosecutor, can say, no, we don't want the police in here. Here's how we resolve things. Here's how we hold our people accountable without locking them up. So join me in welcoming both of them, and from the great state of New Jersey, Senator Cory Booker. Please welcome them all. Oh, he's trying to say something about New York.
We need some Jersey love up in here.
Well, right, Jersey legalized marijuana before New York.
Yes.
Welcome, Senator Booker. Thanks for being here.
It is really, really good and important to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. We're going to continue with the same format, fairness to all the candidates, a brief introduction, but I think by now we know what we're doing here. And I will just say, one of the things that was so interesting in the past two conversations we've had is watching real good faith exchanges back and forth, watching the discussions not coming from a place of the canned answer or just framed pandering, which happens in politics sometimes.
Really?
But really? Yeah, have you heard about that?
No, I've never heard about that.
But really a back and forth, because we're here with experts and with people who are, as we've said, directly impacted. So that's been a really fascinating part of the exchange. And with that spirit, obviously we're going to use a similar format, which is questions from here, I'll keep moderating, and questions from the audience. So with that, I turn it over to Daryl Atkinson.
Thank you, Ari, and Senator Booker, thank you for coming here. You know, we do not consider it robbery that you would take time out of your day and come talk directly to people who've been most impacted by this particular problem. And I discussed with you backstage that we're going to mix it up a little bit.
Yes, please.
And I know you're a tough guy from Newark and you can handle it.
I'm ready.
All right, let's begin. During the past several years, many representatives from Congress and the Senate have traveled to European countries, Germany, Norway, to visit their criminal justice systems that are built on personal transformation and healing. These models have produced a wealth of evidence-based practices that we can learn from. America has the highest incarceration rate on the planet, right? 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prisoners.
Let's go deeper than that. It has 5% of the world's population, but 1 out of every 3 incarcerated women are unionized. And they're the fastest growing population of incarcerated in our country.
I see that you are reading my cards because I was getting to that.
I didn't know that. I did not know that. And these 50-year-old eyes can't do that anymore.
But with that backdrop, that's American exceptionalism on its head, right? What will you do as president to both change policy, but also to change narrative and how we think about formerly incarcerated people?
So this, first of all, I have to say, I said this backstage, I'll say it up front. I am surprised and angry that I travel all around this country. We have what I call cattle calls, where you have 10, 20 presidential candidates show up. And this is a chance to have a conversation with formerly incarcerated people. And we have three candidates showing up? I'm sorry, that is unacceptable in a nation. You just wrote off statistics, but every statistics, there are tens of thousands of stories of personal destruction that have been caused at the hands of a criminal justice system that is patently biased, patently racist, patently attacking the most vulnerable people in our country. We criminalize poverty. We criminalize people struggling with addiction. We criminalize people struggling with mental health. We crush, when I gave the woman statistics, and this is my own confession here, I'm a guy that was talking about this issue since I was in law school, but never was aware until I started meeting with formerly incarcerated women and going to visit women incarcerated, that we have a whole different set of challenges, morally unacceptable challenges. This is a nation that tortures people in prison. I'm not using that word loosely. We do things to people in prison that that psychologists, mental health professionals, and other countries call torture, like juvenile solitary confinement, shackling of pregnant women. So this is not a side issue. This is a moral issue that is a cancer on the soul of our country. And do not ask people what they're going to do when they become president, because it is very easy to put a tab on your website to check a box and say that you care about this issue. What have you been doing for the last 2 decades of your life when we are a country that has seen, since 1980, a 500% increase? So you want to know what I want to do? I don't want to tell you about the future. Look at what I've been doing for my whole career. For my whole career, since I was in the projects in Newark running expungement clinics for formerly incarcerated people, since I was mayor of the city of Newark and opened up our first office of reentry, first drug courts, first youth courts in the state of New Jersey, since I ran for the Senate, and my pollster said, why in every stop from the wealthiest suburbs to the inner city do you talk about this issue? It doesn't poll at the top of New Jerseyans' concerns. And I said, leaders do not follow consensus, they mold consensus. And I'm the only person that can say in this presidential race, in the United States Senate, the only major bipartisan piece of legislation to pass under this president is one with Dick Durbin, got to give him a lot of credit, that I led from the Democratic side in the United States Senate and helped to write itself, and was the last piece of change that got into that bill. I was fighting until the last moment. The last thing that got into the bill was the ending of juvenile solitary confinement, because a nation should not torture its children on the federal level.
So let's quick follow-up on the European models that I lifted up.
Yeah, please.
I was fortunate enough to go on one of those delegations, and we went to Germany and Norway. And people in Germany and Norway never lose their voting rights. You have taken the public position that only people convicted of nonviolent offenses should be able to vote from prison. Can you explain that to a group of folks, some of whom, many of whom have been convicted of violent offenses, how we can take away the fundamental franchise from people?
Absolutely. And I'm going to be very candid with folk. So a couple things. One is, first of all, this whole violent, nonviolent thing, we always have to challenge that publicly. Because people are really willing, and I have my Republican and Democrat colleagues really willing to change laws for nonviolent offenders. But we live in a nation where even that difference has become warped. You and I could be driving along. You're my friend. I just jump out of the car, pull out a fake gun, hold somebody up, jump in the car and say, drive. You are now a violent offender. But more than that, saying violent offenders and making these distinctions means that you don't think someone is worthy of redemption for doing things that I saw people do at frat parties, punching somebody in the face. That person trips, falls backwards, hits their head, dies. That's felony manslaughter.
So with that backdrop, why shouldn't they be able to vote?
Because and this is as candid as I can put it. We create these arguments in this Democratic primary that give the right opportunities to undermine common sense. I think our prison population should be cut more than in half. And those folks should not have had their voting rights taken away in the first place. But this conversation in this primary put me in situations where you're having debates about whether the Boston Marathon bomber should vote or Jeffrey Dahmer should vote or what have you. And so I'm not going there. I've said very explicitly, my cause, my purpose since before I got into politics was to tear down this system of mass incarceration and allow millions more Americans, as a result, millions more Americans to have their voter rights restored. I'm not going to enter into a debate that's going to give a handle on somebody else. When, by the way, if I'm the President of the United States and I have 100 things I can do on criminal justice reform, there's 100 things I can do that will be more empowering than fighting something that right now we don't have the Democratic Party on board on.
But doesn't it give, and I understand not wanting to create sound bites and opposition ads for the right? But this is really a value proposition. And values are universal. They don't just apply to people we like.
I agree.
They just don't apply to people who smell the right way or who look the right way or who are convicted of certain type of offenses. Values should be universal and durable, and they should apply to everyone. And one of our values as a country is one person, one vote. So how do we contravene that just because someone was convicted of a crime that you just said may or may not have really involved violence?
Right. And so my values are clear. And anybody who knows me from New Jersey, I'm literally led by my faith. Matthew 25 guides my life. I'm shocked that people who are passing laws to incarcerate human beings haven't even visited prisons to see the conditions under which they're incarcerated under. Or people that don't come to communities like mine, where you see the devastating effect economically of having a system that is akin. Remember, there's more African-American men under criminal supervision now than all the slaves in 1850. I speak about my values everywhere I go. And when it comes to things I know I'm going to achieve as your president, restoring TANF and SNAP benefits for people who are formerly incarcerated. I just introduced a bill to expand Medicaid benefits to people who are incarcerated. I'm going to fight every single day, and I'm sorry, I will not sacrifice progress on the altar of purity on issues. I am here to make sure that perfect doesn't become the enemy of the good, because in my neighborhood and in your neighborhood, folks need a lot of good right now, and I'm going to be an agent of good, and I'm going to get things across the finish line that make a dramatic difference, like tearing down mass incarceration.
I'm going to take it out to the audience. Our first audience question now is Marilyn Wynn.
Hi, Senator Booker.
Hi, Marilyn.
Yes.
Where are you from?
I'm from Atlanta, Georgia.
All right. My parents lived there for 20 years. I love your
Great
state.
city to be there.
Amen.
Great city to be in. I am the executive director of Women on the Rise, which is an organization that is led by formerly incarcerated women. And we have led the way in collaboration with Racial Justice Action Center to close the Atlanta jail and to repurpose it into an Equity, Wellness, and Freedom Center. My question to you is, millions of young people are going to prison every year for possession of drugs. But the laws that allow pharmaceutical companies to profit off creating the opioid crisis has not been reformed. What policy would you promote that would put an end to the companies getting rich off the backs of people struggling with addiction, and also put an end to the incarceration of brown and black youth for possession of drugs?
So we know this in our gut in America right now, where people see that we have a criminal justice system, as Brian Stevenson says, that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. And so we see people from our communities going to prison for doing things that 2 of the last 3 presidents admitted to doing. We see folks up in college campuses that make jokes about buying pot from their friends and smoking without any concerns. But yet in 2017, there were more marijuana arrests in our country than there were all the violent crime arrests combined. And so this is what bothers me, is that we have a criminal justice system that is not fair and equitable, but targets certain communities. The war on drugs has not been a war on drugs. It's been a war on people and certain people. Disproportionately black and brown people. This is data, this is fact, that there is no difference in America between blacks and whites for using drugs or dealing drugs. No difference. But if you're African American, you're almost 4 times more likely. And that's all African Americans, including kids who grew up in middle class suburbs like me. But if you put the race and economic status, it goes up dramatically more. And so your question specifically is what in my neighborhood, in the barbershop, my community, gets people outraged. that you have a nation that went through a financial crisis where people were coming into neighborhoods like Newark and going all kind of mortgage scams, and you had rating agencies on Wall Street rating trash as treasure, people crashing our whole economy. Nobody goes to jail virtually, and you see people in our community going to jail for minor infractions. And on the drug war, now you have literally drug dealers from pharmaceutical companies violating the law and every aspect of conscience you can imagine. Literally, their emails speak to criminal behavior, and yet there's no criminal accountability. And yet you have people in our communities for small amounts of drug transactions, often for drugs that should be legal, showing none. So as your president, enough. I'm coming after these folks that are violating the law. I'm going to use my Department of Justice to number one, go for criminal penalties for people who have caused this. I'm going to, number two, go for significant civil penalties, because the billions of dollars that we can get from these companies that have violated law and conscience and our values can be used to invest in programs that can give people who are addicted better access to treatment and other programs that can empower communities. I will hold those pharmaceutical companies who have done these crimes accountable, and I will do it with a seriousness that begins to restore people's faith that we have a justice system that doesn't just work for the wealthy, but works for all Americans.
Let's stay on this thread on drugs.
Yes.
You've come out for the legalization of marijuana. In addition, you've talked about mass vacation of convictions, mass expungement.
Yes.
Currently, there's no federal expungement available.
Yes.
What you haven't talked about, though, Senator Booker, is making sure that people who were once criminalized can now participate in these emerging markets. What will you do to make sure that black and brown communities are not left out of the green rush, right? When we see, venture capitalists now making billions of dollars in this industry.
So you don't hear me every time I talk, but...
Not every time.
So I want you to know, I have talked about this loudly. I've talked about the marijuana community. I've talked about it in conventions. I've talked about it at the CBC, Congressional Black Caucus. I consistently make this point. First of all, do not come and talk about legalization of marijuana if you are not talking in your same breath, sentence, paragraph about expunging people's records. To do that is not about justice. It's about giving access to people for recreational drugs. My bill in Congress is a bill on, it's called the Marijuana Justice Act. It also goes even further than expungement. We must also have a conversation that the revenues that we're going to make as a government, the billions of dollars that are coming from the tax revenue, should be invested in those communities that have been disproportionately harmed by marijuana enforcement. And it is an act of restorative justice that take families that have been destroyed, parents taken away from their children, people whose economic well-being has been crushed. We should be investing those tax dollars into making communities whole that have been disproportionately injustice. But we don't stop there. We also go further and say that if you're talking about marijuana laws and marijuana justice laws, we must begin to talk about forcing states in the same way that states were forced in the 1994 crime bill, literally given incentives and consequences as they did not build more prisons and change mandatory minimums. I'm going to use the power of the presidency to do that reverse and begin to give you carrot and stick to start having laws, drug laws, that are about restorative justice. Now, finally, 100%, man, I've had this conversation with mayors. I've reached out to people I know that have the ability to set the rules. I was involved in the debate in New Jersey to make sure that we do this. Absolutely. We cannot have a system now. Heck, I talked to this with Nipsey Hussle's team. Nipsey could not even get a loan from a bank to invest in the Opportunity Zone laws that I passed, that I wrote, because of past drug convictions. This is devastating right now that we are seeing a billion-dollar industry start that is now not allowing people with past criminal convictions. But remember, just African Americans in general in this country do not have the access to capital, equal access to capital that you see from other communities. So this is something that I have lived, that I have talked about, that I've been active on during this whole marijuana rush that's going on. Because right now where it's headed, with the exceptions of cities, give a shout out to Eric Garcetti, in what Los Angeles is doing, which is clearly making sure that there are set-asides and others to make sure there's equity and inclusion. There are some cities doing it right, but they're the exception and not the rule, and I will continue to be doing things from my platforms, no matter what title I hold, to call this out, that you cannot exclude African Americans who have been disproportionately punished from the marijuana enforcement, now excluding them, putting barriers to them and others from getting involved in the opportunities on the upside.
We're going to set up the next audience question, and since you said you want to call things out, I want to give you an opportunity. You said at the top of this, other candidates were missing. Do any names come to mind?
There are 3 candidates here. The 2020 elections does not stand for the year 2020. It stands for the number of us running, 2,020 people.
So are you going to name anyone who you think should be here?
I will name everyone. Where are you today? Where are you? Sincerely, this is a major national crisis. From the time I was in law school to the time I was mayor of the city of Newark, we were building a new prison or jail every 10 days. We have taken our national treasure and plowed it into the black hole of locking human beings up unjustly, as opposed to investing in education, job training. We could shout out all the things we should have been investing in.
And we're going to do the next audience question, I believe. Where's Joe? Yes, sir.
So how you doing, Senator Booker? My name is Josh Glenn. I'm the co-director / co-founder of an organization called the Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project. We based here in Philly. Adult county jail awaiting trial as of 10/2019. So the question for you is, do you believe children should be ever prosecuted and incarcerated in adults prisons? And also, as president, what steps would you take to ensure that states come into compliance with the JJDPA and remove all children out of adult jails and prisons?
So first of all, thank you for the question, Josh. Thank you for the shout out to Ava DuVernay. Her Netflix documentary 13th, I'm actually in talking about a lot of these issues. And again, what have you done on these issues? The torturing of children? Think about yourself when you were 16 years old and what you would do in a adult maximum security prison. So you were charging them. So let's just be clear. And I call out every candidate to what are you doing on this issue now? I have a piece of legislation that changes the age of criminal culpability, literally addresses this, raises it to 18 in the United States. We have states where you can be charged as an adult criminal at 14, 15. That is insane. What have we become as a society to say that a 15-year-old is eligible for life sentences without parole? That is unacceptable. No other developed nation, as you were saying in the beginning, does these things. What we are doing to children and girls in our prisons is outrageous. The story of Khalif Browder got a lot of attention. That is not an exception. We are sitting here right now, and there are thousands of children in America who are incarcerated, and they haven't even been convicted of anything yet. And they're being put into solitary confinement and conditions. And let's not narrow this. Let's open the aperture right now. I've called for the end of all private prisons in America. And right now we're sitting here while the
time to be raped just to see your people. I almost didn't see my husband when I found out he was strip searched. I didn't know that at first. And so I want to think about what those ongoing traumas are and what we need to put in society in order to address them.
So for me, trauma started when I was a young girl. I grew up in an abusive home, and my grandmother had a boyfriend who was extremely abusive to her. My mom and dad separated, so my mother moved home, and I obviously was with her, and it was probably one of the most horrific environment experiences I've ever had in my life. But it also, every move that I made, like when I was a young girl, going into high school, making a decision to go to UNC Chapel Hill, and then going to grad school, trauma followed me every step of the way. It didn't matter whether I went to therapy or not. There were certain triggers. People could say or do something to me, and they didn't have to physically touch me, right? You don't have to be physically touched to be traumatized, but you can remember. And one of the things I used to be so angry with God about is my memory. Like, I could remember every single moment of being experiencing trauma as a child. or every memory of the moment that my mom was physically or sexually assaulted, or that my grandmother was constantly abused, and I had to live in that space.
And I'm going to push us a bit. We only have 5 minutes, and I want to make sure we get everybody in here. And just thinking about what needs to be in society in order to address the trauma of being incarcerated, what would be the one thing you would say, we got to have this? I'm going to ask all of you to name that.
We need trauma-informed trained workers inside the prison facility. And we need our officers. Now, I personally would say that the officers that are currently there need to be fired because they're the ones that trigger us the most.
Yeah.
But obviously they need a job, but they need to be well trained as well.
Thank you. And Manuel, what would you say to that?
Something that began to heal me was understanding who my friends and my enemies were. Now, we can't talk about mass incarceration without talking about the underlying engine that fuels it. This capitalism. But saying that can get us in trouble. You don't say, you can say venture capitalism, vulture capitalism. Do you say venture slave owners, vulture slave owners? So we have to understand that there's walls that have been built, economic walls, physical walls. Some of us are feuding among our own communities because of capital, not having access to capital. So we have to name it to tame it. And unfortunately, there's 44,000 collateral consequences behind a capitalist system that corporations, transnational corporations, are profiting it. Once we understand that, my comrades and aspiring comrades, we're going to get to be able to understand how cancer works. You don't say good cancer, bad cancer, but guess what? The last thing we'll say, that as my comrade Ayrton Morales said, that reminds us back to the Bible, sometimes a prophet is not welcome in his own home.
Come on. George, how would you add to that about the traumas how can we address the trauma of having been incarcerated?
Well, it goes without saying that the very first prisons were the slave plantation and the reservation, and the very first police were the slave patrol and the cavalry, right? So how the hell are you going to reform that? You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Can you have a more humane slave plantation? Can you have a more humane cavalry that committed genocide against First Nations people? Hell no. So what we have to do is just dismantle it. And this is a $1 trillion industry, straight up. In my county alone, in Alameda County, we're spending nearly $500,000 a year to incarcerate one young person. So what we want is a dollar for dollar match. That's our reparations right there. You know what I'm saying? So that we can invest fully in providing all the things that we need. I mean, everything we do is basically crimes of poverty, crimes of harm because we've been hurt, you know what I'm saying? If we had adequate housing, education, viable employment opportunities, if we had access to the resources, opportunities, and programs to allow us to move beyond our traumatized self to our authentic self, then we're going to be in it. And we have the resources. It makes no sense. We will improve the life trajectory of folks. We will improve actually public safety, you know what I'm saying? And it will be cost saving in the long term because prisons bankrupt. They just... you know what I'm saying? They nearly bankrupted the state of California. So
Thank you so much for that. And you know what? You answered 2 questions in one because I was going to talk about what creates public safety, and you just ran down that list. Thank you, George. And Dorsey, let me give you this last 45 seconds and change the question up a little bit. Did you hear anything today from our candidates that gave you hope?
You know, like what I didn't hear, right? They haven't figured out what they want to do with us, right? They really haven't, you know? So what I would tell them is to come up with a narrative where we would fit, that would be just. They can only tell you about limited policies, and it's like putting Band-Aids on bullet holes.
Right.
You know, we need them to actually look at us as if we had something to contribute in society, as opposed to helping us because we the downtrodden. As long as you let them maintain that view that we the downtrodden, they're not going to invest in you as if you had a return.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Although I do want to acknowledge the 3 people who came here today. I'm forgiven. We're at times. They're about to cut me off. Go ahead, say something quick.
Oh, I got to say something quick.
2 seconds.
Because there was some people that put work in on this stuff that was beyond the people that's sitting on this stage.
Don't take
that
my
need
job
to be
away now.
acknowledged and appreciated publicly. So your Vivian Nixons, your Darrells, your Norrises, and all the other people that put much more work on this particular event than a lot of other people, I need to acknowledge them for doing good work. Because if I don't do that,
So and Dorsey takes my job away, and as we bid you farewell, I also want to acknowledge all the folks at Eastern State Penitentiary who made this happen, all the brothers and sisters who've been standing on point and on their feet all day. Let me acknowledge my colleagues at the Rabin Group, at the Soze Agency, at the Center for American Progress, at the Marshall Project, our partner in this, and our media partner, NowThis, have all stood with us, bent, twisted, did whatever they needed to do to make sure this happens. And I want to acknowledge two people in particular who moved mountains. And I know because I was on phone calls and texts with them. Please acknowledge in the back Ed Chung and Davine Trentman, who did so much to make this happen. But it's all of the staff, and it's all of you who have continued to do this work without fail and without falter. Thank you all so very much. We are at time. Good night.
Before everybody leave, y'all sit back down, rush yourself, sit back down, rush yourself. No. First of all, I want to thank everybody for being here present, especially y'all in the room, folks who are watching it live stream, probably getting up, running, getting popcorn and everything else. But y'all stuck with us. That's right. And 9% of this whole event was about showing up. And so when the question came to some of the candidates, why they chose to show up and the other ones didn't, I always believe in the law of reciprocity. You know, is that if you show up for me, I'll show up for you. And so people have showed up. And when some of the candidates realized that there was over 138 watch parties in 22 states, they realized that their message is actually getting out on our dime. Don't be twisted about that, but on our dime. But more than anything else, what I wanted to say to everybody is that today was historic.
Yes.
Not just historic because we're in this space, but when you look at the collective number of years that we all been inside, where we actually honed our skills at, our skills were honed long before we hit the ground. And so this is for us to take away, especially for the folks who in our listening voice, is that this is a movement. This is that movement we have been talking about, trying to build. We're building it. Everybody's probably wondering, well, what's next? Well, we're organizers, so we always lead with an axe. So before this time next year in February, I saw Mike sitting here a minute ago. Mike Briggs was our national organizer sitting back in the back. We're launching a national voter registration campaign in February to organize formerly incarcerated people across this country to be ready for November 2020. So one of the things I told all the reporters who was asking me a question, why is it so important people show up? I said, because if they can't show up for us in October of 2019, we won't show up for them in November of 2020. This is how you build power. There's got to be something in it. Because I listen to a radio station that's WFIM. And y'all probably trying to figure out what that is. That's what's in it for me. What's in it for me? That has to be this channel that we listen to. When somebody called us and say, hey, just like Darcy said, everybody was reaching out, they were calling all of us. Here's my platform. Will you read and give me some feedback? I said, no, if you want some feedback, show up. We'll give you all the feedback in the world, but you have to show up. And so this, again, is all about us showing up. And one of the things Brian Stevenson always say about things is what? Being proximate. You have to be close to it. So those folks who showed up today, that was being proximate. They was coming to be grilled about what was going on. The usual suspects who didn't show up was primarily because they was afraid of their record and being called on their record. And so we're not kind of like going to people with hat in hand no more. We're not begging nobody for anything. Today is the beginning of us making demands. This is the day we start making demands. This isn't about give me, let me, can you spare? Because at the end of the day, everybody who was here and those who didn't show up, you know what they're doing? They're campaigning for a job. The only thing is now we're the interviewers. with interviews. So now we get a decision whether or not we want to ban the box or not. Whether or not we want to hold their past actions against them for what they have done to us. And so this is real in the sense of how we're showing up and showing up in a way where people have to be. And for all the folks who own the airwaves and everywhere listening at us, being a part of something and belonging is two different things. This is probably the most inclusive group of folks that you can be a part of. I remember some of us with Ms. Marilyn, Darrell, some of us was at the White House during the last administration. Make that clear. Make that clear. During the last administration, make that clear. And the question came up about, we was trying to get a policy change about banning the box. And one of the things we were able to explain to people that none of us had a traditional job. Some of us had to lie to get jobs. Some of us created jobs. But at the end of the day, people recognized that one thing was that, one, we was united and that we were inclusive. Because they started telling us about everything and everybody else. They started talking about the LGBTQ movement. They started talking about the same-sex movement. They started talking about the immigrant movement. And we're saying, wait a minute, that's some of all of us. Our network is some of everything and everybody. So if we see ourselves as being this thing that's bigger than everything and everybody, that's when we win. That's when we win. This is ours for the taking. This is ours for the taking. We're on the goal line. And all we got to do is call the play. That's all we got to do is call the play. So I want to thank everybody again for showing up. Not only showing up, showing out. And I'll leave you with this one phrase. The world changes when people, ideals, and money get organized. Thank y'all. Y'all have a good evening.